people always think if I say UNSW, they always think that I'm in Sydney.
All right.
Yeah.
So,
hey, Tim,
yeah.
do you want to set the chat so that
I just did. Yeah, I just noticed
people?
that.
All right.
Yeah. So we'll give it a couple minutes for people to roll in before we start.
Yeah, no worries. So we're not live now?
Well, we are.
That means.
I mean, everyone in the room can hear it. The recording started, but I mean, I'll clip it. So.
No worries.
That's nice.
All right.
Thanks for the questions. I'm supposed to use the pseudonyms here. What is it? Tripod. Thanks for the questions.
Is he in here? Let's see.
Tripod's not in here. Not yet, at least.
Well, at the very least, you can check the recording later. So, let's see here.
Any of you guys college students yourselves?
I am.
Oh, yeah.
Kind of, but I'm in my senior year. I'm doing an early thing, undergrad.
Earlier schooling.
I'm doing my BA, my last year of high school.
Okay, yep.
Right now in Victoria. I'm from New Zealand, though.
Okay, yep.
All right, so I guess we'll just get starting to get into it. So for everyone here, we're talking to I actually didn't check on the pronunciation. Is it David Stahel?
That's actually very good because most people say Stahl, but Germans say Stahel, so you got it right.
All right, so I won't try it again now that I've gotten it right. So, yeah, we've got David here. He is a history professor, correct?
Yes. Well, technically in Australia, in the US, everyone says professor. It doesn't matter whether you're an assistant professor or associate professor. In Australia, you would only use that if you were a full professor. We have 5 academic ranks, and I'm the middle one, so that's a senior lecturer. So we technically wouldn't use professor for me, not here. But I notice every time I go to America, everyone says professor, which is kind of nice when you come from Australia, but you don't really have the title yet.
All right, so, he's a historian, as I understand it, specializing in the Eastern Front of World War II. He's written many books, in particular about Operation Barbarossa. Is that correct?
Correct. Yep.
All right. So could you tell us a little bit about your books?
Sure. The first thing I might just say is, when I talk to people who are perhaps outside of academia and they, look at the books that I've got, if they're honest, they tend to say things like, wow, this is super detailed. Like, how many books have you got looking at 1941? Doesn't this war begin in the middle of 1941? And the first book covers about 2 months, then the next book covers, I think, 5 weeks, and the next one's about 4 weeks, and the next one's about 5 weeks, and then I got another one that comes about 8 weeks. Now that sounds like, oh my God, laborious detail. The one thing I would say to everyone who is perhaps not so well read in this area is never underestimate just how enormous the war in the East is. We tend to subsume the Second World War into, oh, well, people fight everywhere. There's fighting in North Africa, there's fighting in North Atlantic, there's bombing, there's, the Allies get onto Western Europe in June of 44. Oh, and there's also a war going on in the East against the Soviets. Yes, that's all true. There are multiple fronts. But it is the lack, especially in the Anglo-American world, of people to understand scale. For example, the most famous German general of the Second World War is Rommel. Rommel commands never more than 3 divisions in North Africa, 3 German divisions. There's a few more Italians. On the Eastern Front, in 1941, there are 150 German divisions. It's quite literally the difference between 50,000 men in North Africa and more than 3 million in the East. So when I come to writing these books, and 2 months on the war, people might say, and maybe there's something to it, that that's a lot of time. It's a lot of words for a small period. At the same time, if you can imagine that scale, the amount of paper that 3 million men generate, and then you say, well, I'm going to be an expert and write about 2 months of that, that's a lot to cover. And never underestimate how many people are dying in these 2-month periods or 1-month periods. Far more would die in any one of my books than happens in an entire year or even in the entirety of the North Africa campaign. Depends on the month I would pick. But it just gives you an idea of scale which most Anglo-Americans have no clue about. So it looks like, oh, this guy must be charting every last detail way down in the trenches with Sergeant Schultz or whatever. Far from it. My books look at something called army groups. That almost doesn't exist in military history. You never get armies so big that you would have multiple armies under an umbrella organization called an army group. That's just phenomenal scale. We're talking, 1.7 million men in Army Group Center, and it's just enormous. And there are 3 of these army groups. So below an army group is an army. Below an army is constituent corps, and within those corps are divisions. That's what I'm looking at. And the smallest of those formations is 15,000 German soldiers in a division. 15,000. A lot is going on there. So I am not down in the trenches. And that's actually how a lot of, for example, Australian military history would be written, because we just have much, much smaller formations, even in the Second World War. So you end up, really at sort of battalion, regimental level to discuss actions, because that's the level at which it's taking place. And on the Eastern Front, that's just completely different. So it's important to have an appreciation of scale, perhaps right off the bat. Excuse me, perhaps right off the bat. And the books that I'm writing are what we would call operational histories, which is to say, there's multiple kinds of military history that you could write. I wouldn't say I'm exclusively operational, but what I'm basically trying to do is understand, how does the German Wehrmacht, so the armed forces of Germany in the Second World War, how does it fight warfare? And there's a big spectrum within operational military history. And that spectrum is very large because it's a very popular area. People love this stuff. So people are generating books that are, academic and rigorous, and people are generating books that are just war stories, right? So there's a big spectrum in there. I would obviously like to think my books are much more on the rigorous side. And that's very important, because I think if you want to understand these operations well, you have to get beyond just what the readership find, how to best put it, sexy. People love campaign histories because I want to be in the tank with, Guderian and discuss all of this stuff. Should he have gone left here or right there to encircle this big group? In order to understand these operations, yes, that's also relevant, the battle side of things, but it's just as relevant to understand much more context, which is less perhaps interesting to your run-of-the-mill military history reader. What do I mean by that? Economic factors come into this. Resources come into this. Manpower factors come into this. Even social history. Part of the books I'm writing, I said I'm sort of partly operational, but I'm also partly social. We have to understand, why do people fight? What is their motivation? What's driving them forward, especially when you look at the horrendous casualties that are taking place. And the other big thing I would say here is, there are actually kind of 2 wars happening in parallel in 1941 in the East. There is the war that we all are expecting, that I'm going to talk about today, a conventional war, a Red Army versus a Wehrmacht. But there is something happening in parallel on the German side. They are also conducting a war, you could say, against the population that they're occupying. And there's all different facets of that. In German, they call it a Vernichtungskrieg, a war of annihilation. That's the great bulk of what German historians write about. German historians don't tend to write operational history. That's still a bit of a taboo in Germany today. I lived there for 11 years. I did my PhD in Germany. And I remember one of my first meetings with my, it's such a great term, in Germany, you don't have a supervisor for your PhD like in the Anglo-American world. You have a Doktorvater, your doctor father. I love these things. But he was saying to me when I first met him, he said, "Oh, look, David, I think it's very good that you're from Australia if you want to do this kind of topic at the Humboldt University." And I kind of thought, why would coming from Australia be any kind of advantage? Why does that mean anything? And I since discovered, as you sort of not just learning about history, but you're learning about the society and perhaps even something as indistinct as German identity. I learned, wow, there was a bit of a backlash for some people in the university I was at, because some of them just don't consider military history to be wissenschaftlich, so academic. And I definitely disagree with that. I think those people are very much on the wrong foot. I think military history absolutely has a place, and that's really my point. If you want to understand operations, you need to have a sense not just of the mechanics of the Wehrmacht and how it makes decisions and how its supply functions and how its intelligence is gathered and how operational decisions made. All of that belongs to military history, to operational history. But you need to have a sense of much bigger things. Like I said, motivation. And where do we get that kind of literature from? To no small extent, the motivations of these guys has been researched to a tremendous extent in context of the War of Annihilation, because the historians working in that area, trying to understand this ubiquitous criminality throughout the Wehrmacht, are coming up with all of these social studies about how do these guys understand the world, and what are they doing? What are they writing in their reports? How do they explain this stuff? What do they write to their wives when they write home? That is as important to understanding the War of Annihilation as it is to forming a view of how these men construct their reality. And that's important for me, being able to offer analysis on their military operations. For decades after the war, these two areas, War of Annihilation and operational history, were completely separate. People either did one or the other, and they sort of worked in their own hemisphere. And I think one of the nice things about the historiography that has changed in the last 20 years, maybe 25 years, is a lot of the younger, I'm not that young, but I'll count myself in the younger category, a lot of the younger people who've been working on this area, and not exclusively, but I think the older tended to fall into one of those two groups, have been really reading in both areas. And I don't think it's really possible to research in this field anymore without reading in both areas, because one informs the other. And this would be my answer to those Germans who sometimes say, what is operational history? If you want to understand the War of Annihilation, frankly, you are always going to be better at doing that if you start reading military history, because it is relevant. I mean, maybe just one quick point on that in case anyone has, got that in their head. One of the relationships in understanding the criminality that goes on in Nazi Germany is to understand that the radicalization of Nazi policy is linked to the progress of the war. As the war gets worse, that criminal side, the greater the reaction from the Germans. They start to realize, well, we haven't got enough workers. We'll go to the east and take slave laborers. And this becomes, a slave empire. And so, and as the war gets worse, what do? They start with measures to, first discriminate against Jews, then put them in ghettos, and by Barbarossa, they're shooting them, and then they, systematize that into mass murder in camps. So as the war goes on, the response from the Nazi regime is always more radical and always more murderous. But if you want to understand, if you accept that, which is, I think, an established theme of Holocaust studies and War of Annihilation, it seems interesting that you wouldn't therefore study the war. And people like me are doing that, are charting, this is how the war is going on, this is how decisions, it's how these guys are reporting what's happening and how they're experiencing it. So one informs the other. Sorry, I might be giving you a bit more of a general overview here of the field rather than perhaps more specifically my books. But yeah, the books follow on through Operation Barbarossa. By the way, I didn't set out. I had no clue. When I started this whole journey, I was not envisaging, multiple book series or something. I was just a lowly, student just starting out as a graduate. And I actually even remember thinking, God, if I start a PhD, maybe I'll get into, my 40th page or my 50th page and suddenly say, I got nothing more to say. I don't know what else to say anymore. But I think, that's probably one of the self-doubts a lot of people have going down this path. And what I discovered, to my satisfaction, I guess, is that when you get into the German military archive, wow, there is just so much paper, and that tells its own story. Suddenly you realize, in order to chart these events, there's almost more than one can cope with. A book sounds like a lot to an average person. You imagine a 400 to 500 page book, that's a lot. But then when you look at, imagine a warehouse filled with paper. how much of that could you ever get into a 400, 500-page book, especially when a lot of that book is also going to be analysis. It's not just reporting what's in documents, it's analysis. It's you making sense of it for the reader. And that's kind of daunting, but it's also kind of nice. It's like, wow, there is so much going on here. And I don't think we get that much from one more book on the Second World War, 1941 to 1945. Yeah, I'm sure there are still good books at that scale. We need books like that, and there's some wonderful ones that have been written. But I think a reader who already perhaps knows the basics of what happened and who the major people in this war are, they want something more. They never underestimate how good the readership is out there. There's people out there who are very, very clued into the Second World War. They don't have doctorate titles. They don't work at universities. They don't need that. They just read. The one thing I always tell my students is, guys, if you want to know this stuff, there's really no such thing, and this is a real misnomer in academia. Maybe it fits to other fields, but it does not fit to history. There's no such thing as the brainy student. Oh, he's got a high IQ. He just knows heaps of history. Maybe that's true of mathematics. Maybe you can just be a genius and you just know that. I hear those stories about people who see numbers and things. I don't know if that's true. But I do know in history, the only way you ever know stuff, it's blood, sweat, and tears. You sit there with a book and you consume it. And you can do it because you have to, because someone says you got to read it. You can do it because, no, I just find it interesting. And that's always, I think, the best path to, discovering a love of history is just finding authors, finding books that you like and just sitting there. And, I used to do that myself. I had no clue. God, I went to tech school. I was learning woodwork, what we called EWP, engineering workshop practice, sheet metal. I had no clue. My father's a tradesman. My mother was disabled. She was blind. She didn't work. So I had no, I'll always PhD and live in Germany and learn a language. Not at all. It was as simple as, geez, I find that stuff's really interesting. Geez, I don't know what trade I want to do, so I'll stay at school. I finish school. I don't know what to do now. I don't want to do a trade. I can't really find one I want to do. I could go to uni. God, all the private school kids. I got there, did a World War II course in my first year. Thought, my God, that is the most interesting thing of all the 4 subjects I had to study. Oh, that World War II stuff was super interesting. Went on, did another course because they offered it on the Holocaust. Thought, geez, that's still so fascinating. And one thing led to another. Before you knew it, I'll stay to the next thing. Oh, I don't know what I'm going to do, though. I'd never had any visions of being a historian, but it's just kind of worked out. And why? I think passion. Like so many things in life. Not that I'm here to give anyone life motivation or anything like that, but I kind of do think if I have one thing I've learned in 45 years, that is, there's no substitute for just being motivated about whatever it is that you do. And in a sense, when I think about the enormity of work that is required to do those books, which, people who just meet me for the first time and say, oh my God, you must have done so much work. Yes, there's a lot of work. At the same time, it's easy to do, not because it's easy, but because if you have that, great passion, in some ways, I guess the way to sum all this up is, that old saying, the more you know, the more questions you have. I would definitely say that has been my evolution in this space where I, read books and thought, that was awesome. That was super interesting. And then I pick up the next one and I realize, wow, that guy's saying this, that's sort of different. And then I'd go and talk to my tutor when I was doing my course for the first time. And then I started to get to know people who were interested in it. And just one thing led to another. And the cool part is 25 years in, that hasn't, it hasn't gotten old, and it hasn't gotten to the point where, wow, people always say, oh, you must be kind of sick of it, right? Books come out and you think, oh, tiring. I've already read all this. I just read it once more again. What those people don't understand is books aren't generic. It's not like every World War II book, just because a lot of them say, or whatever it is, Operation Barbarossa. They're not saying the same thing. The one requirement, if you ever send a book into a publisher, is, hey, what's new? They're not going to publish a rehash. They don't want that. They want to offer something new. And you can often sort of, when you get used to that, you start to realize how many people are sort of, trying to find some different shade of gray on the same old story. I wouldn't say that so much of Barbarossa, but when I look at some areas, maybe if I'm honest, Australian military history, because it's just much smaller, there's a lot more people doing it. And, and I sometimes get this feeling, God, this is just the next shade of gray on the Lost Battalion in God knows where. That's not the case with the Eastern Front. Guys, if there's anyone out there who is, on any level interested, even maybe in the recesses of your mind thinking, yeah, would I one day want to do a PhD? The virtue of something like the Eastern Front is, again, that scale means there are huge topics that, unlike other areas, they just don't have as many researchers. There's no one who's necessarily gone through and written a book on subject X. I mean, my second book was called Kiev 1941. And to give you an idea, that is a battle in which the Soviets are going to lose about 1 million men, 665,000 POWs. And we don't actually have exact figures on what did they lose in terms of killed and wounded in the course of the battle. But you can estimate it's around about 1 million men all up that they would have wiped off the register. My book's the first one in English ever written on that battle. How many battles of the Second World War with 1 million guys being wiped out could you say in whatever that book came out, 2012 or something? There are whole 1 million man battles that have just never been written about in the Second World War. Most people will say to you, "Oh, the Second World War. Oh my God, isn't that a little overwritten? I mean, how many books on D-Day do we need?" And I don't even know if that's fair, right? I don't work on D-Day, but I'm pretty sure if we projected ourselves into the future 200 years, there's going to be some smart dude who's come up and written something really interesting. In fact, I heard a paper last year on D-Day that was fascinating. So, there's always new stuff. We don't know what we don't know yet, and people are always coming up with new things. But welcome to the Eastern Front, because that is the unknown frontier. In fact, I would say the same of the Second World War in China. We always think the war against Japan is some American Pacific thing. And yeah, that's super important and it's major. And of course, there'll be good, exciting new work to be done in that space as well. But when you look at how many Chinese were killed, how much of the Japanese army was deployed on these islands versus how much in mainland China, you start to get an idea that our knowledge in the Anglo-American world, all our English-speaking books on this topic, they are good and they are necessary, but they're not necessarily telling us, they're not concentrated on the areas where most of the killing and most of the dying is taking place. That is happening in China, that is happening in the Soviet Union. And the aggregate sum of literature doesn't really always reflect that. Even some of the mainstream histories of the Second World War are, I would say, skewed toward an Anglo-American or Anglo-American theatres. So yeah, look, maybe that's just a bit of an overview introduction to the field itself. It's a little bit less on specifically what are my theses in each of the given books I've written, but at the same time, I suspect when we get into this, I've seen some, preliminary questions that people have put down. Maybe we can unpack that more in that space. But that's perhaps a good general overview, and I'll at this point perhaps hand it over to you guys to engage with whatever you want.
All right. So the main thing we want to talk about today is Operation Barbarossa. Barbarossa. I don't know. I'm familiar with the guy, so I always just pronounce it Barbarossa, which I assume the Germans probably pronounce it a little bit differently. Is that right?
Yeah, and it actually comes from the Italian barba, beard, rossa, red beard, because Frederick Barbarossa was the Holy Roman Emperor 800 years before, who went campaigning in Italy, and he got that nickname. So how do the Italians say it? Don't know, but I'm sure there's multiple pronunciations.
So, the reason why, so it was actually, Tripod that invited David here. I'm really glad to have David on, of course. But Tripod told me the reason why is because he and I have discussed World War II Operation Barbarossa, and he thinks I'm wrong, and he wants David to show me up. So a lot of people here are not going to be that familiar. Sorry if there's a little bit of background noise. My dog's walking around. I think he wants to play. But a lot of people here are not going to be too familiar with Operation Barbarossa. Could you give us, I guess, like a fairly brief overview, 10, 15 minutes or so, for those who just never heard about it?
Yep, sure. Okay, so maybe the best thing to start with is, 1939, Germany invades Poland. As a response to that, the British and the French declare war on Germany. Then we have a period of a few months, which is called the Phony War. They call it Phony War because there's no fighting going on. Then on May 10th, 1940, a major German offensive in the West is undertaken. Make a long story short, it's phenomenally successful. And France is conquered. Belgium and Holland also fall under the Nazi occupation. The British are now very much on their island. The Germans attempt to take that. They have a Battle of Britain. They're basically trying to secure the airspace over Britain in order to facilitate Operation Sea Lion, the planned invasion of Great Britain. It's not terribly realistic. They lose the Battle of Britain, and then basically there's stalemate. Britain has instituted a blockade of Europe, and the Germans in the First World War were also subject to a blockade, and it turned out to be very, very costly as the years rolled by. Germany was slowly starving. They were starved of also resources to fund a war. And so the British had instituted that again. Now, the Germans had a way out of that in the Second World War. Before the invasion of Poland, they'd struck a deal with the Soviets, which is the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, the Nazi-Soviet Pact, some people call it, which basically is a non-aggression pact. But actually, there's a secret clause. And the secret clause is they've gone through the Nazis and the Soviets, Eastern Europe, and basically divided up all of the independent countries there between them, basically saying, you guys can have that, we'll have that. If there's one thing that unites the Nazis and the Soviets, it's the fact that, well, yeah, they're both expansionist powers, and they've no interest in, that they have a very much strong interest in occupying these eastern spaces, or eastern for Germany, western, I guess, for the Soviets. So that's the secret clause. There's also an economic component which says the Germans will send high-grade machinery to the Soviet Union. The Soviets will pay for that with large amounts of raw material. That's the way out for Germany. They're going to be able to get past this blockade by getting everything they need from the Soviet Union. So at the end of this campaign in France, Germany ostensibly is locked into a long-term war because they can't end it against Great Britain. And that's not just Great Britain, it's Great Britain's empire. A lot of resources, a lot of manpower, and there's no way the Germans can get across that channel, end the war. And at the same time, the British can't really starve Germany into defeat because the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact ensures that Germany is getting its supplies out of the east. They're not blockaded. And what Hitler then starts discussing is a solution to his problem. He's discussing with his high command, could we invade the Soviet Union? He asks for operational plans, strategic plans for how that might be conducted. And he wants two things. He's thinking, the reason the British won't give me peace is because they hope that their last continental ally will join them in this war. And that is his thinking. If I remove that, if I occupy the Soviet Union, the British will then make peace because they'll see they have no chance. And the second thing is, currently we have to trade to get these supplies. But if we occupy the Soviet Union, then we can just take whatever we want. Basically, they then begin these operational plans, and the German command are submitting plans that basically substantiate these ideas, suggesting that, yeah, this is going to be a realistic opportunity. We can do this. So on the 22nd of June, 1941, the German armies invade. And as I was saying before, don't underestimate how big this invasion is. The Germans don't invade with sort of one hand tied behind their back. This is 150 divisions. Now, they have got more divisions. There's 3, as I said, in North Africa. There are a sprinkling of a few other divisions along the western part of Europe, basically defending Europe against any prospective British attack. Not that that's likely. But one thing we have to understand is those other divisions are very much second-rate. Division, we use that term, but there's multiple grades of division. And the ones that are basically not involved in Barbarossa are very much, they're not first-rate divisions by a long shot. And the best parts of this Barbarossa army, this Ostheer, as they call it, the Eastern Army, is the Panzer Groups. That's the most important part. In some ways, what you could say here is the Germans are invading with 2 armies. They have their Panzer Groups. There are 4 of those, 1 in Army Group North, 2 in Army Group Center, and 1 in Army Group South. And that's one element, these Panzer Groups. That constitutes in total about 30 motorized and Panzer divisions, 30 of their divisions all up. The other 120 that make up that Eastern Army are infantry divisions, and they are completely different in the sense that the Germans invade with 600,000 horses. This isn't this motorized juggernaut that you sometimes see presented in documentaries and things like that. They show all these pictures of German tanks driving in. That's the smaller part of the German army. That's the Panzer Groups. The overwhelming bulk is literally marching under their own power into the Soviet Union with thousands of wagons and hundreds of thousands of horses. The artillery is towed, the field kitchens are towed, everything is moving in at a slow rate. So when Barbarossa kicks off, this is super important. What's actually driving the German armies forward? When you look at these maps and you see where the line is and where the Germans have reached, that's the Panzer Groups doing that. Those opening weeks of Barbarossa, that one part of the German army is way out ahead of the other part. The other part is doing its best to catch up, but how fast can you walk, right? And these guys are having, it's murderous. When you read the field post of the German soldiers, it's the height of summer. They're fully equipped with their own kit, sometimes carrying ammunition boxes and things. and they march, 18 hours a day, and they are totally exhausted. In fact, I remember reading in one set of letters that this guy said, "We're so exhausted." This is somewhere in July. He said, "We've already had people die within our company or whatever it was, battalion, from exhaustion." These would be young guys, but the grind is so hard, so long, hot weather, and they're trying to catch up to the Panzer Groups. Why is that significant? So what's basically happening here? They are launching in. The German plan is you break through at the frontier. These Panzer Groups encircle around behind the frontier at a depth of sort of 200-300 kilometers, close the encirclement, and those Soviet forces on the border, where the border armies are, will be encircled. They'll be destroyed, and then you've destroyed the defending Soviet armies, and you basically have exploitation phase where you then drive on into the rest of the Soviet Union and occupy. That's the basic part of the war directive that underwrites this Barbarossa plan. And the first stage, you could say, functions very well. They do break through the border. They do enact an encirclement. What we call the Battle of Minsk. So I said there's these two Panzer Groups in Army Group Center. Let's just use that as our example. They punch through. They encircle. They meet around about Minsk together. They've now encircled the Soviet armies. I think there's about 3 armies that are inside that pocket. Those armies are in total chaos. Remember, the Luftwaffe is attacking them, all the rest of it. They're in complete chaos. And they've closed that encirclement. We call it the Battle of Minsk. It's probably better called the Battle of Belarus because it's happening on such a huge scale. And then they drive out again deeper into the Soviet Union. But the problem for the Germans, and this is where we have to start to understand that Barbarossa isn't actually as successful as I would argue a lot of the pre-existing histories have argued. The problem they're having is twofold. One, it's how you move in the East. So how can I make that clear? We would imagine that when the Germans suffer losses, what's happening is they're engaged in a battle and someone destroys their tanks or their artillery or whatever, because that's how you lose things in war. That makes sense. But actually, movement in campaigns also has a cost. Imagine those distances, again, hundreds of kilometers. And it's not like someone gets in a truck and then drives to Minsk. That's not what they're doing is they drive up to the front, then they drive back to get supplies, and they drive back up to the front, and they drive back to get supplies, and got to go out there and deliver something in. And it's swampy and it's forested. And if you look at the roads, they are dirt roads with potholes because this is not built for major armies with quite literally tens of thousands of vehicles to drive on them. And that's what the Germans are attempting to do with technology that was built in the 20s and 30s, right? So they haven't got wonderful suspensions and all these kinds of things. Most of their vehicles are requisitioned out of the civilian economy. So they're, these are basic vehicles. And there's all kinds of traffic jams and all the rest of it. Of course, they are sometimes suffering attacks. And so they're driving forward and there's an attrition. They are losing vehicles all the time. And the only way when you get to that depth that you can sustain huge armies, or even the divisions of the Panzer Groups, the only way you can really do that effectively is by extending your rail lines into the Soviet Union. And the rail gauge in the Soviet Union is wider than the rest of Germany. Now, the plans sort of said, well, we'll capture Soviet locomotives and rolling stock, and we'll be able to use those until we can continue our conversion rate. Well, reality is they don't capture very much of that. And the Soviets are very effective in destroying their own networks, which means that those German construction crews that have to convert the gauge, they thought it was going to be super simple. Hey, how hard is this? We've got a Soviet gauge. It's much wider. We just knock up the pins, move the rails closer together, knock them back down again, and hey, presto, conversion taken place. But if the Soviets have destroyed the infrastructure, and sometimes the destruction is the Luftwaffe themselves, they've gone in and attacked Soviet infrastructure, and they don't have the ability on a Blitzkrieg timetable, this short war. The whole Barbarossa plan is predicated on 6 to 10 weeks. 6 to 10 weeks, that means you just got to keep moving. There's no time to build infrastructure, and those guys aren't equipped to do it at nothing like the scale that they're going to have to. So as the German Panzer Groups drive further in, two things are happening. One, they're losing their mobility quite rapidly, and they're also not getting their supplies at the speed that they need to sustain that exploitation phase. Then there's another problem that they encounter. As they burst out from Minsk, they're going to drive on another big encirclement centered on Smolensk. Maybe just because I know people are probably sitting there thinking, geography, David, geography. Okay, from the German-Soviet border, it's about 300 kilometers to Minsk. It's about another 300 kilometers to Smolensk, and if you were to go from Smolensk to Moscow, you'd have about another 300. It's something like 900 kilometers or so in total depth. So they're beginning the second phase of this, and they don't anticipate that they're going to meet great Soviet resistance. Because haven't we just encircled the Soviet armies at the border? But the Soviet system is built into military districts. Now, the overwhelming bulk of the Soviet army is deployed in their western military districts, which, yes, have just been attacked, and those armies are encircled and functioning, are not functioning very well. But those other military districts are doing two things. They're sending their forces now to the front, and the Soviet system has a mobilization base of about 12 million men, and those guys are being tapped in the last week of June, and they're raising something like 5 million men, and those millions of men are being formed up in their areas, being shipped to the front. And so when the Germans, by the middle of July, so 3 weeks into this Barbarossa campaign, are now trying to close the second big encirclement on Smolensk, they're encountering two things. One, they're really struggling to get enough fuel and ammunition to the front lines to enact this encirclement, and they are encircling at Smolensk, so it looks like, wow, they're doing really well. But then two problems. One, they realize how weak they are to actually hold this second encirclement, because the backbone of the German army, the infantry, they're still way back in Belarus. They're still trying to catch up to Minsk. These guys have got hundreds of kilometers to march with all their attendant equipment, and those armies in Belarus haven't yet been dealt with. I mean, there's a huge area. They've got to now sort of, enact this encirclement and crush those armies. They've been encircled, but that doesn't mean they've been destroyed. And there's another whole encirclement forming much deeper into the Soviet Union, for which the Panzer and motorized divisions have very little support. They don't have very much infantry. And they're having to deal with that on the inside of their second encirclement. But more to the problem, new Soviet armies are arriving outside that encirclement. They've been raised, they've been sent on the trains and so on to Moscow. Now they're being sent out toward the front lines, and they're attacking them. So they're basically fighting on the inside of their flanks and on the outside of their flanks at the same time. And those are costly battles. So if you look at the aggregate number of German losses, in July of 1941, the number looks quite small, right? So everyone will conclude, the Soviets, look at the phenomenal Soviet losses. This is clearly the Soviets who are losing this war. Look a little bit deeper. Ask yourself the question, but where are those German losses overwhelmingly concentrated? In motorized and panzer divisions. These are the much smaller German formations that drive Blitzkrieg, that drive Bewegungskrieg, what we call war of movement that the Germans are enacting here. If you suffer too many losses here, and they're not just losing manpower, as I said, the fact that they're even this far into the Soviet Union, they've lost a lot of their motorization. They haven't got a system that's going to facilitate this resupply. And one of the things that's causing this is the roads themselves. Imagine roads that are extremely dusty, and then you drive over them, and huge amounts of dust get thrown up. They talk about, if you read the German field post, gosh, we're driving in clouds of dust, so much so that they sometimes say, I can't see the vehicle in front of us. Now, imagine what that's doing to a 1930s air filter. And we know that that's having real problems because it overwhelms those air filters, and it means dust's getting into the engines. And tanks don't get transported on the back of trucks. They drive under their own power. So they're driving hundreds and hundreds of kilometers on crappy roads. Even separate from the battles they're fighting, they're starting to get so much dust in the engine that the only thing they can really do is they try and flush it out by just pumping a whole lot of oil through the engine. So I just keep filling the engine and just sort of, just try and wash this stuff out of there. Of course, that doesn't really work. It's a stopgap measure. Get some of it out of there, but it's always more going in. And so the engines are slowly seizing up. If you look at the number, in any one of these Panzer Division files that you go into, if you look at the number of total Ausfall, so totally destroyed vehicles, it's usually a small number, right? This is July of 1941. They haven't lost that many. Look at another column, try and find out how many of them are no longer serviceable. because they've just suffered mechanical problems, it's a much higher figure. In fact, I've got a figure for the 7th Panzer Division, just by way of example, that said, I probably shouldn't do this off the top of my head, but 75% of the Mark IV tanks had been lost by the end of June. The 7th Panzer Division is the biggest Panzer Division on the Eastern Front in terms of the numerical number of tanks, and it had lost 75% of their Mark IV, which is their best kind of tank, by the end of June. It wasn't destroyed, but they're broken down. Ask yourself a secondary question. How do they repair a tank in the field? Yeah, all the preceding German campaigns, Norway, France, the Balkans, they basically lost tanks the same, tanks break down, and they don't try and repair them in the field. They don't really have a capacity for that. The campaign ends quickly. That was always the intention, to rapidly win. And then they literally transport them back to the factories and repair them there. So they don't have an ability in the field to do this. They will develop that as the 1942 goes on, but they don't have that on their very short timetable for success. Now, all of these attendant problems, which, unfortunately, I think preceding histories have not really dealt with. They just look at the big picture, right? Because they're not spending enough time, if I'm honest, in the archive really nutting out what are the operational problems. But when you start to look at all these things, hang on, where are the supplies coming from? How do they gather research, gather intelligence? How are they coping with these separations of these two basic invasion forces that they have? How are they replacing losses? How many, even basic things, how many horses do they have when they start losing horses? Don't underestimate these. The same attrition that's taking place in motor vehicles is happening in livestock as well. And how much do they have to replace these things? If it's a 6 to 10 week timetable, they're not planning for a long campaign. They're basically saying whatever the Ostheer is, that's what we'll use to defeat the Soviet Union, and they don't have redundancy. And that's going to cost them, because it basically means if the Germans can't destroy the Soviet Union on their own timetable, there's no contingency for anything else. So if we just take one more quick thing, we look at that Battle of Smolensk. It takes a lot longer for them to close the encirclement at Minsk. It is, at Smolensk, and it's much more costly to the Panzer Groups. So if we're looking at August now, basically, to give you Guderian's Panzer Group, he has lost about 2/3 of his tanks. Most of them have just broken down, but a significant number are also destroyed. I can't remember exactly the figure, but 2/3 are gone. Now, he's got 1/3 left. It's still summer. It's the middle of August, but the Blitzkrieg timetable doesn't have any, he hasn't got that much time in summer left of good weather before it's going to start getting muddy. And it's only by this stage that those infantry divisions have basically caught up to the front. And so now they're there, but they're not the forces that are going to, smash through the infantry divisions, that is. They're not going to smash through the Soviet front and drive hundreds of kilometers. They're not much different from Napoleon's style troops. They've got horses, artillery, and manpower that offers the Eastern Front some strength now. But that element that drives German success, that has been denuded to no small degree. And that's happening across the Eastern Front. So there's less and less offensive momentum. And the other thing we have to consider this in is that the Soviet Union is an expanding funnel. As you drive further into it, the breadth of your front is going to get deeper. So on the one hand, the Germans are suffering losses, so their forces are thinning out. At the same time, they're having to stretch them further across the front. Now, let's just say one last thing, and then maybe I'll go to questions because I know I'm crapping on here. One last thing about it also matters what's happening on the Soviet side. Now, everyone knows these big battles are costing the Soviets huge amounts. Contextualize that with this. I said that they're raising 5 million men in June, but they're raising more in July, more in August. For all that the Soviets are losing, and I don't want it down to you like I'm trying to play down Soviet losses. They are catastrophic. They are huge, right? Sometimes unprecedented what the Soviets are going to lose in 1941. But that 12 million man mobilization base mean that they are constantly raising new armies. So much so that they are going to actually be growing the size of the Red Army over the course of 1941. So as the Germans are thinning and struggling to make that operational fist with which they can again try and launch another offensive and break through the Soviet front again, the Soviets are actually covering those spaces in spite of their losses because they have reserve armies coming up to the front. Now, I don't want to suggest to you that, the Soviet Union is doing so well in 1941, but they are a long way from doing the one thing that the Germans must do in 1941. They must end this war. They have not planned for a long, high-intensity war in the East that's going to tax the German war economy tremendously, because they're having to now fund a war in the East with all those attendant pieces of supply, more trucks, more tanks, more artillery, more planes, more troops. That's all got to come out of the German war. And remember, this whole thing is predicated on the idea that we're going to fight a war in the West against Great Britain, which requires completely different armaments. It requires ships and planes. That's now the worst case scenario for the German war economy. They've got no access to their raw materials. They're subject to a British blockade. They can't seize a lot of the Soviet resources, because they're not going to get as far as the Caucasus, which is oil. They get to eastern parts of the Ukraine, which is good. They need to get those supplies. But the Soviets have destroyed a lot of the infrastructure. They've collapsed their mines. They've blown up their dams. That's going to take a lot of time and resources for the Germans to exploit those areas. And they don't have the manpower for it either, right? This is huge distances. So, you can start to see what a disaster Barbarossa becomes. On the surface, it looks like, hey, classic indicators of success. Who's driving forward? The Germans. How many tanks are being lost by the Soviets? Far more than the Germans. But actually, the standards for success are very different. The Soviets need to hang on in 1941, and they do. The Germans need to win, and they don't. Which is why my first book is called Operation Barbarossa and Germany's Defeat in the East. Maybe at that point, I'll leave it there, because that was kind of... but at least you have an idea.
All right. So I will ask my own question first. Have you played Hearts of Iron?
No, I don't actually know what Hearts of Iron is.
Oh, really? Oh, okay. It just sounded like something you'd be really into. It's a ungodly complex World War II game. All the history nerds seem to
playing
play
it.
So, yeah.
One of my students told me Steel Division is an Eastern Front game. I did actually Google that at one point, but I can't say I've played it either. Yeah, no. Maybe that's my geeky academic side, which is, oh yeah, games, awesome, sound like a lot of fun. I was a total computer gamer back in the day. We're talking Commodore 64, Atari. I mean, this is the 80s, right? You're probably going, oh yeah, retro. Good on you, David. But then those books, you started reading books, dude. You missed out. Yeah, no, I haven't played.
So just by the way, I find it's really interesting. A lot of people who do know, a lot about these different historical events, they actually learn a lot through games. It's actually kind of surprising how accidentally informative they can be.
No, absolutely. Look, when I was living in Germany, I had a really mate, and he was playing with me Rome Total War. I'm obviously not a Roman historian, but exactly what you say there, mate. When you start playing, I was like, oh, this is really interesting. I started to look around, just Googling, not trying to consume huge amounts of Roman history. But the more I sort of looked, because I was kind of curious how much of this is actually what it was. And time and again, I thought, wow, this is actually quite well done. And as my career's gone on, I have actually had one or two people start talking to me about what they know, and I say to them, oh, how do you know X, Y, Z? And they've said exactly that. Well, I actually play these games, and they tell me all these things. The one thing I would say that can be a little bit of a misnomer in the gaming community, and I say this with, I don't know that community, but that tends to devolve into a lot of technical schematics, right? Like, I can tell you all about the armor thickness of the blah blah tank in 1943. Great, and that's important. That's an element of operational history. But those games then get divorced from, as I say, those other bigger, wider factors, which I would argue are more important. So I think sometimes there's internet debates going on about, if the Germans had this tank in this year, would they have won the war? Oh, it's so much more complicated than that. And maybe just one quick example, and then I'll go to another question. But the Soviets, I said before, they lost 20,000 tanks in 1941, or I think I said that. People often ask, well, if Germans invaded with 3,500 tanks, and the Soviets have in excess of 20,000 tanks, how come they just don't do better? Like, on the surface, that seems like, yeah, that kind of doesn't make any sense. The Germans are the big blitzkrieging army on the attack, and the Soviets just seem to fall apart. It's precisely because technology, believe it or not, doesn't change warfare. I know that sounds like, what? Of course it does. No, it actually doesn't. It's the response to the technology that changes warfare. I don't want to get all academic-y on you, but what that's basically trying to say, if we use that example, is it matters how well trained are those Soviet tank commanders and crews? What is the doctrine by which they're incorporated? Do they have radios? Do they know how to use them? Do the guys commanding them, what sort of supplies do they get, right? How many spare parts are there for those? And basically, if you unpack a lot of those secondary factors, or what seem to be secondary factors, you start to realize, oh, these guys are not well trained, have terrible doctrine, don't have radios, under-equipped, undersupplied, command and control falls down, and then your piece of equipment, which on the one hand sounds really good, T-34s. They have T-34s in 1941. They do indeed. Fantastic tank. Much better than actually any German tank at that time. But the piece of equipment is not the important thing. It's the response to the piece of equipment that actually transforms that into a war-winning asset. And that is true, my friends, of military history. And that is not my view of military history. I think that is something that if you got a lot of military historians and started talking about, gunpowder back in the day and they first invented it, people think, oh, it must have transformed everything. Actually, it didn't. It didn't. People didn't really know what to do with it, and it doesn't come on the scene as this amazing new thing. It's actually laborious and problematic, and some people experiment with this way and that way. And it takes like 150 years before we really start to notice, wow, gunpowder is now transforming sieges. So it's not what people often think. With a rudimentary knowledge, they tend to infer more than is true. I'll leave it at that.
All right. So we'll go to my favorite of Tripod's questions. He wants to know, what do you think was the greatest strategic mistake for each side of Operation Barbarossa?
Yeah, this is a perfect this because, if we were in a lecture, I often hypotheticals. I don't know. We're getting into things I can't prove by pointing to, evidence and documents and things that we feel safe with. But in this forum, you can say what you like because this is more like the pub room chat, where you can explore things. I read these questions about 5 minutes before I jumped on. And so, maybe if I thought about it more, I'd have other ideas. But I guess the one thing I can see that the Germans could have done differently, well, actually, they could never have done this because you can't remove Nazism from the Nazis, and they are Nazis and they think like Nazis, which is to say they think in racial terms and all the rest of it. But let's just leave that aside. This is all ahistorical. If they'd invaded the Soviet Union with a policy that had said, suddenly they're not Nazis anymore, they don't think racially. Look, we've got all these disaffected peoples in the Soviet Union. It's not like everybody loves the Soviet Union. In the north, that Army Group North is driving through the Baltic states. They were only occupied, so that's Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia. Those are proud nations with a very individual sense of history, and that is not a Russian sense of history. And they're occupied by the Soviets, and it's a pretty brutal occupation in 1940. So they've newly been occupied, and then the Germans are rolling into those territories. Oh, do they look at the Germans as liberators? Absolutely they do. In some ways you could say they have no idea who's coming to occupy them. But in their minds at the time, these guys are liberators, right? And there's plenty of people prepared to join the Germans, and that is to say join the Germans in fighting against the Soviets, but also join the Germans. Remember what I said, there's a parallel war here, a war of annihilation. Oh, there's all kinds of pogroms going on in those countries where they're literally killing their own people, particularly Jews, who are seen to have been, Soviet, sympathetic to the Soviets. And so, they're complicit in their own form of the Holocaust, no question. A lot of literature has been generated on that. But the other big opportunity is down in the Ukraine, right? Ukraine, collectivization under the Soviets, it's a terrible process, and starvation takes place in some of those areas. And there's plenty of photos, if you Google, of Ukrainian villages greeting oncoming Wehrmacht soldiers with great banners and the traditional sort of salt and so on that they sort of throw, and welcoming in German soldiers. Now, if that had all been harnessed for the benefit of backing the Wehrmacht, I don't know that it would have won the war for them, because there are also problems in that space. It's not some sort of, they could have raised a 1 million-man army. Sometimes you read these things, they could have raised a 1 million-man army of Ukrainians and thrown that at the Soviets. No. Would they have got 1 million recruits? Maybe. But the problem is, in modern warfare, where does all that war equipment come from? The Germans themselves have scraped the bottom of the European barrel just to put together this enormous Ostheer. How much does that require to marshal together 3 million men and drive them forward? Yeah, they've gone through the French arsenals that they've captured. They've gone through everything to basically put that army together. There's a whole hodgepodge in the German Wehrmacht, in that Ostheer. that is the Barbarossa invasion force. They did not have, millions of spare rifles and helmets. Certainly not the trucks or the artillery or the anti-tank guns. Now, some people have said, oh, yeah, but they could have gotten, all the surplus Soviet stuff that they're capturing. Well, the Wehrmacht themselves are taking the best of that. The trucks that they capture, they desperately want them. They desperately need them because, what did I say before? There's attrition here. So they're just trying to replace their own losses. And when the infantry get it, because they didn't get it in the first place, they want motorization. They want anything they can get. They would not have handed all this over to some sort of nascent Ukrainian force. What would have been left for them, this would have been a poor man's army, make no mistake. And they would have suffered in the same way. Where do their supplies come from? Even if you got Soviet stuff, where do you get the shells for all their Soviet weaponry? So that's, I think, one of the missing elements for the Germans that they could have benefited from, and they end up with a lot of partisan units in these rear areas because their practices are so terrible, and they could have offset that negative as well. What was the question? The question was benefits, and also for the Soviets, yeah?
Question was, what was the biggest strategic mistake of each side?
Oh, okay. So my strategic mistake for the Germans would have been, the political missed opportunity to, benefit from the occupied territories of the Soviet Union. And I guess for the Soviets, the biggest strategic mistake, I would say, is it's less a political one. I would say it's more an operational mistake. One of the things about 1941 you wouldn't know from the fact that the front is just constantly being pushed back is that the Soviets are highly offensive. Their whole military doctrine, they never foresaw that they would be fighting a war on their own territory. The Soviet, military policy was offensive. We will drive into foreign countries because that kind of makes sense. It's never good to fight a war on your own territory. It's your resources, it's your land, it's your people that are being occupied or being damaged. So they want it to be offensive. In the opening days of Barbarossa, what are they trying to do? They're constantly sending out orders, attack, 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 which is terrible. And this doesn't really change through a lot of 1941. The Soviets are constantly launching offensives. In a few small instances, these are successful, but the overwhelming majority of them are disasters, right? And if they'd changed that, if they'd recognized, okay, what they really needed to do is, you would say, if we use military language, so you screen your front. So you would man your front, but with lighter forces. So I'm thinking perhaps, if I pick up the story in maybe October, there is another big German offensive. They've basically caught their breath after this Smolensk campaign. They catch their breath through September, and then they relaunch this big offensive on the 2nd of October, Operation Typhoon it's called, and they're basically trying to get to Moscow. Now, the Soviets have time to prepare for this. If they'd screened their front with lighter forces and held back their bigger armies maybe to a depth of 100 kilometers, that would allow you to identify when the Germans break through, where are they breaking through? But if you pack all your forces up against the front, then when the Germans break through, the moment they do that and they drive 50 kilometers, you're already basically half encircled, and there's no ability to react in quick time. So you're being pinned at the front as the Germans launch, attacks across the front, but light attacks, and the Panzer Groups are rapidly encircling you. The answer to that is an operational or strategic deployment where you screen your front, you hold back your main forces so they're not facilitating their own encirclement, and then you counterattack the breakthroughs. And the Soviets don't do that. It takes them a long time to sometimes learn elementary lessons of large-scale warfighting. And if they'd adopted those, and it's not to say that some of the Soviet commanders don't see this, there's constant, without getting into each individual theater and battle and which commander says what, but if Stalin had been more receptive to this, rather than this sort of, blockheaded idea that, we'll just launch attacks, we're going to take back our territory, attack, send that army in, it's just craziness. But he doesn't understand military operations. And he has a very slow, just like Hitler in some way, has a very slow learning curve. And a lot of the Soviet officers, because of the whole, the purges and so on, these guys are sometimes trumped up into positions they should not be in, and they have no understanding. And yeah, that's a real missed opportunity for the Soviets as well, not to marshal the forces that they had much better, and they would have suffered far less losses.
All right. So next, Fox Terrier has a couple of questions. Fox, are you here?
Yep, I'm here.
All right, well, go ahead.
All right. Hello, David.
Hello.
So In your books, you discuss and advocate quite at length the strategical importance of the Battle of Kiev. Well, you made a book on it. And that though it was a German victory, the battle delayed Operation Typhoon, and some have argued that that may have saved Moscow. So my first question on Kiev is, what do you think would have been the consequences for both the Soviet and Nazi forces if Hitler hadn't issued Directive Number 33?
You mean to encircle the Soviet southwestern?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, that is one of the. I mean, what people love to do in military history is argue the alternative, the what if, and all of that. And so, one of the classic what ifs, and maybe just as a bit of context for the rest of the people, you sound like you've read quite a bit in this. I was talking about that army group center that's driving forward because they have two Panzer Groups, and actually those two Panzer Groups have more tanks in them than the Panzer Group that's in the north and the Panzer Group that's in the south. So it's the center is very, very strong, and they're driving forward. Minsk, Smolensk. Now they are far deeper into the Soviet Union than especially Army Group South, and that creates a problem for the German Central Army because they. What do you do with that army? Hitler has the idea that they now divert to the north and they divert to the south and basically break north and south with these Panzer Groups and assist the other army groups, which are reaching their objectives at a slower rate. So Army Group North is driving toward Leningrad in the north, and Army Group South is nominally driving into first to Kiev and then on into the eastern part of the Ukraine. That is not, however, how the Army High Command see it. The Army High Command want to drive deliberately to Moscow. They think that's the war-winning strategy. And there is a real debate that goes on from late July right through August, where Hitler and the High Command are in basically a standoff, arguing which is the better alternative. Hitler wins that. Of course, he wins that. I mean, it's not a democracy. There's no real, he stands six to his guns, but. What that means is, in this time, they've basically ended the battle at Smolensk, and now Guderian, which is the southern of those two army groups, Panzer Groups in Army Group Center, that's the one that's going to have to drive into the Ukraine, and that's now an available option to them. That offensive is very successful. Why is it successful? It's not successful for a lot of the reasons people often thought. Oh, the German army, they're so strong. Actually, Guderian's Panzer Group, as I said, they've only got about a third of their operational strength remaining, but they're a lot deeper into the Soviet Union, and they're driving into a Soviet formation that's called the Central Front, and that's extremely weak. It's probably the weakest Soviet front. It's basically just constructed on paper, thrown together with a few units, and that's what Guderian's opposed by. He's driving into this eastern Ukraine, and because, as I said just before, Stalin is a complete blockhead, he utterly refuses to give up Kiev. This is a little bit hard to explain without people having a bit of geography, but Kiev basically is therefore at the western extent of what's going to be a very large pocket, and Stalin will not let Kiev fall. So none of the forces that are holding this huge bulge in the southern part of the Soviet front, none of them are allowed to withdraw, and that all those armies are basically subsumed into something called the Soviet Southwestern Front. Guderian's driving in behind that from the north, and Kleist, the Panzer Group commander in the south, he crosses the Dnieper river. Again, you have to have the geography a little bit, but he's in the south, and he's driving up into this bulge from the south, and together they will close behind the Soviet Southwestern Front, and all of those Soviet armies, 4 Soviet armies, actually I think it's about 4.5, are encircled. That's 650,000 guys that are going to be encircled. And as they then realize, oh God, we've been encircled, they then break east trying to get out of that encirclement, and they're losing their equipment. And when they finally reach the German lines, the Germans have been able to prepare, and there's just catastrophe and disaster for the Soviets. And that's, that is in a nutshell the Battle of Kiev. Sorry, dude, what was your question again? Sorry, just repeat that.
My question was, what do you think would have been the consequences for both the Soviet and Nazi forces if Hitler hadn't issued Directive Number 33?
Okay, sorry, I go into these things and forget what I'm So that's super important, that context, because, okay, now everybody knows what happened. That is the what happened. So the alternative here that's being suggested is, well, what if they hadn't pursued that? What if they actually just said, no, Guderian, he's not going to drive down into the central Ukraine. He's going to drive on to Moscow. There's two problems with that scenario. At least this is how I see it. Some people will disagree with this in literature, but Army Group Center is on a shoestring of logistics. Now, if you're going to drive to Moscow, that's another 300 kilometers further to the east. Now, while the Battle of Kiev, as it was to play out in September, takes place, basically what they're doing, they're using that month to build those train lines, as ramshackle as they are, because these conversion rates they're not very good. They're very low quality lines. The trains can only travel at, I can't remember what the speed is, but 20 kilometers an hour, 30 kilometers an hour, 50 kilometers an hour. I don't know. It's very low, far slower than a normal train, because the conversion is so bad that's the only way, because they could just derail these trains. So they're continuing those conversion lines. Now that's super important, because how do you drive Army Group Center forward? The infantry have now caught up to the front lines. They're going to be driving forward with 1.7 million guys. You need supplies. So those weeks are super important to continue that conversion. If you just said, okay, don't do the Battle of Kiev, just continue to drive. It's late August now. Just drive toward Moscow. Yeah, with what supplies? And the supplies that you're getting are coming by trucks. So you send your truck back. The idea is you have a railhead, right? The main bulk of the supplies come on the railhead. Then they're all deposited there by trains, right? Can transport huge amounts. Then your truck goes back to the railhead, picks up the supplies, and drives to the front. Now, if that's a 30-kilometer distance, fantastic. That's efficient for a truck. But imagine a truck that has to drive back 150 kilometers. It then picks up supplies and then drives at low gears, slow, because the roads are terrible, 150 kilometers. That's not efficient. In fact, the part of the load of the truck is just going to be the fuel to support the truck as it drives slowly, slowly, slowly. The longer the distance, the less efficient the what they call the hand luggage, doesn't translate well to English, the less efficient this system is. The trucks are only good at short distance, and you've lost a lot of trucks. And the fallout rates are going to be even greater the longer the distances they have to cover are. So that time that's supposedly, often people who write this stuff say, oh, they lost all this time in starting their attack against Moscow. They didn't really lose the time. They need that time to extend that logistics. I'd love to talk to you all about battles people like, but this stuff is no less important. So that's the first problem. You need those supplies. Even when they launch Typhoon, they're still on an absolute shoestring of logistics, right? These guys are not living with what they have, they're living with what they've got. The other thing is, if you didn't do that, first of all, you'd be launching Typhoon weeks earlier without the supply. But the other thing is, you wouldn't have destroyed the Soviet Southwestern Front. That is the largest Soviet front on the Eastern Front. And on its own, Army Group South wouldn't have had the capacity to do what it did, because it had the help of Guderian's Panzer Group. And I'm trying to remember what the army is. There's an army in the north, Second Army, that helps facilitate this encirclement, because they're holding part of the northern part of the pocket, right? That's another element of Army Group Center. And imagine that. Army Group Center is now driving much earlier on Moscow, and they have a very long southern flank. Every time you advance another 100 kilometers, you need to deploy more and more of your strength to the south just to hold this long, long southern flank. The virtue of enacting a battle at Kiev means you've crushed it. I mean, 1 million guys don't exist anymore in the Soviet order of battle. And yeah, you've taken Kiev and the whole of the Ukraine, and the Army Group South is now able to continue the advance in parallel to Army Group Center. Why? Because that huge Soviet formation, multiple armies, has just been wiped out. So Army Group Center has a secure southern flank. It's being protected to no small extent by Army Group South, as it should be, because they're also able to advance. And Army Group Center's supply lines have been not secured, but at least given them a lifeline with which they can try and supply this enormous force that's continuing to drive eastward. And so this argument, this alternative argument people come up with and say, oh, if only they'd just gone early, shows no understanding that Army Group Center needs its logistics and it needs its flank secured. So yeah, I'm obviously there's no ambiguity about what it is I think happens. And look, I'm sometimes seen in the the internet discussions and things. Oh, David Stahel so anti-German. He's so critical of them. Um, that's I am critical. Absolutely. How can you not be critical? These guys don't necessarily. I mean, at a tactical level, yes, the German army is very good, no question. I mean, without parallel, really. But at the strategic level, no. The strategic direction of forces and the middle category between the tactical and the strategic is operational. And people often conclude that, yeah, tactically they're excellent and operationally they're excellent. And I see that there's a lot more questions about how good they really are. There are elements of their operations that they're good at, and there are elements that they are terrible at. It's no good just fighting battles well if you don't understand logistics or intelligence. And those are two areas the Germans really show time and again that they don't really understand that stuff. So yeah, maybe I'll leave it at that and let people ask questions.
All right.
All right.
So
Fox,
do you
you
want
want
me
to
to
go
do
ahead and
my?
ask? Yeah, go ahead and ask your second question.
So this question's more on why the history in Western history's seen this way. Why do you think the Battle of Kiev seems so unknown or left out in Western history, even though it was extremely significant in Operation Barbarossa?
Yeah. Oh, that's such a good question. I'm not even sure I know the answers to this. Partly, I guess, we're a product of our own life experience and so on. And, for me, as I was sort of saying before, I do find this area just so inherently interesting. It's kind of hard for me to understand why aren't more people, getting into this space in World War II, especially when you look at how many people seem to be fascinated. I don't mean to be harking on this, but I work at the Australian Defence Force Academy, and there's huge amounts of interest in Australian military history. I think that's fine. Yeah, I get it. We're Australian, but look, I'm Australian, and I went down this path because I basically concluded at a relatively early stage, even in my first year of studying this at uni. I just remember thinking, wow, the Eastern Front, there's so much going on there, and I just remember going to the library once, and the internet was nothing like what it is today. And I just did a search on how many books could you find. We had the title D-Day or El Alamein or something like this, versus how many could you find on Barbarossa. And when you think about it, those, especially something like El Alamein, is so much smaller scale. Yet heaps and heaps of books. You do something like Barbarossa, it's hugely significant, far less hits. And I thought, wow, this is the real. You don't like to think. We're in the Anglo-American world, right? We're not North Korea. We don't have propaganda at the same time. What does everyone know about World War II? It's a kind of skewed understanding. So then you come back to your question: why don't we illuminate battles like that? Why don't people do more on that? I think the best I could do as an answer is partly that people don't understand that context. They don't understand how big the war in the East is and how significant. Maybe it's also people who perhaps even do understand that. There's plenty of people who read military history. Yeah, but for some reason, people just default into their own nation state. I just want to know Australian military. I just want to know New Zealand's military. I just want to know American military history. I'll let the Russians worry about theirs. And fair enough, if that's your interest, I guess, and that then generates a market. But I wonder if for academics, and this is perhaps a real difference that I learned when I was living in Germany, for academics in the Anglo-American, it feels like learning a foreign language is, oh my God, a mountain to climb. My God, if you had to learn a foreign language, that's just for us huge. I mean, I remember when people think because of my second name, oh, you're German or you've got German parents or something. Not at all. I mean, our family history comes from Switzerland, but in the First World War, so nobody in my family speaks German. I had to learn it basically as an adult from scratch. And my German's not perfect by any means, but it's good enough. I wonder if when I talk to people in the Anglo-American world, they seem like, wow, that's above and beyond, David, not just doing a PhD, but bothering to learn a foreign language. You realize when you live in Germany, that is just so normal. People go to school, and anyone who's sort of in educated circles, of course they speak English. It doesn't mean that they don't make grammatical mistakes and so on, but they have basic English. They often have learned French or Spanish as well. So the idea that someone would learn a foreign language is far less of a big deal to them. In fact, one of my housemates, when I was living there, this is so funny to me, she wanted to go the next year to India. So, no, it wasn't a big deal to her. She went to night school and decided, I'm just going to do a 6-month course learning Hindi. Because when I go on my big, long trip to India for a month, I want to be able to speak to the people. And I thought, that is so normal. Once you get used to Germany and educated circles, she's not exceptional. People just do that kind of stuff. You can't imagine almost someone announcing, I'm going to learn Hindi because I'm going on a holiday there. People just wouldn't do that. At least is my impression. Maybe that says something about my circle of friends. But I think it says something culturally. And I think in the academic space, if more people could get over that mountain of, a foreign language, you'd probably get a lot more interaction because, the final frontier of World War II, well, not the final frontier, but the area for really interesting macro topics that still haven't been explored, that is the Eastern Front. I don't know if there's macro topics, million-man armies, million-man battles that haven't been written. Definitely there hasn't been. Definitely that's not the case in the Western space, right? There are a lot of books. Again, in fairness, there's probably still stuff to be written there. They don't have to be million-man armies that you have to write about. But, that's the opportunity in the East.
All right, cool. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
All right, so next I'd like to get to Rep Manoj. Rep, are you here?
Yep. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, David, thanks for doing this. So I'm going to be the guy to ask about the T-34.
Okay, yep.
I definitely understand that when it comes to technological surprise and conflict, it usually gives you only a short window of time to operate. We see this in World War I, the German use of poison gas, first in the Eastern Front, but then in the Western Front. Within about 2 weeks, the Western Allies had makeshift gas masks. When it comes to tank conflict, we also see it in the Yom Kippur War with the Israeli tanks facing the Egyptian use of Sagger missiles or anti-tank missiles that by the end of the conflict, the crews had developed countermeasures. So the question is, when it comes to the German experience, why didn't they, or why was their surprise? Was it racism that they thought the Slavs were an inferior people that couldn't develop these weapons? And what was the internal discussions within the German high command about how to deal with this? So it's like, I've read Gerdion's book talking about dealing with the T-34. I'd be interested, like, when it comes to the US military, there was the IED defeat organization to look at IEDs in 2006 to deal with the Iraq War. So I'm wondering, within the high command, what were the discussions like? What organizations were set up? And last thing I'll just add, sort of separately, do you see Operation Barbarossa as similar to the beginning of the Pacific War, where Admiral Yamamoto said that really they only had a 6-month opportunity in order to press their objectives before they had to sue for peace, or else the U.S. was definitely going to win in a protracted conflict?
Yeah, maybe there's quite a bit in there. The final question, is that something that we could say of the Eastern Front? Look, I don't think that the German High Command have that same. When I say they've got a 6 to 10 week window, that's, I think, objectively provable, because you can look at these operational factors and you can say, okay, there's also a seasonal element to this. Once you get to October, it's the seasonal rains that will start. If so much of this war is taking place on these, open fields and terrible roads that aren't sealed, imagine what that will do for your mobility. So these things are objectively provable. The Germans have a window of opportunity to do what they said that they would do, which is end this war. And don't underestimate how big the war is, right? Million-man armies crunching together. German losses in July of 1941, dead, 68,000. This is the successful phase of their war. I mean, if you think about all the men the Americans lose in Vietnam, 1950s, 60s, and half of the 70s, it's 58,000. America is a much bigger country numerically, right? And that's, tremendously costly war. 58,000 guys over 25 years, right? The Germans lose that in July, more than that, in July of 1941. So it goes to show, what does this thing cost you, even when you're being successful, driving forward, doing all those good things? So there is a window of time here. And even though the German High Command don't talk about that, no one writes a memorandum in October of 41 saying, well, the war is lost now. And I think if you ask the question, then why don't they recognize that? I think that's probably another longer answer, which I won't go down because I want to address your other question. But I think it's got a lot to do with what I would say is National Socialist thinking. I'm quite convinced more and more as I've spent the years working on this thing that, we probably start in a place where we say, well, the German officers were not that different from, American or British officers. They're products of staff schools. They're not Nazis in the sense that, they had their formative years long before the Nazis came on the scene. So we've often given them a bit of a pass, right? And I think that's also a reflection of the earlier literature, the stuff that I read when I was first sort of starting out in all of this. That, these guys were somehow, yes, they spoke a different language. Yes, they had a different culture on some level, but they're essentially commanding officers. That's how they present themselves, like Anglo-American. That is completely, I think, untrue. Two reasons for that, in short. One, never forget about that war of annihilation. These guys are doing things that Anglo-American commanders would not have done, right? They wouldn't sit by and allow mass murder of women and children. Did these guys know what's happening in the rear areas? Oh, all of them knew. All of them. All of these Guderian and Munstein, people sometimes say, oh, they're my heroes. Oh, really? Are they your heroes? Well, congratulations, because those guys are implicated deeply in mass murder and genocide. And if you think, oh, they were wonderful commanders, you've got some problems with your politics, because there's no ambiguity about that. Just read any of the very good stuff. Most of it's in German, but very good stuff on the war of annihilation. These guys are complicit both in what they know and in what they facilitate, and that's ubiquitous throughout the German high command. So they're indicted, and that National Socialist way of conceiving of the world is part of what doesn't allow them to see a lot of the operational problems that are right there in black and white. How do I know what I know? Simply because I read their own files. But I'm not reading it with their, ideological constraints. They still believe in Hitler, right? So they're not writing those memorandums saying, yeah, this is catastrophe, right? Look at how does this even work with and they're very operationally focused. They're not necessarily linking it to economics and resources and manpower and how does this thing ever play out, right? They're not joining all those dots. And that perhaps is a bit more reflection of the German operational culture. Okay, and the other thing was looking at the surprise that they experienced with the T-34s. I think what I got out of that is, how are they coping with that surprise, and what are the internal discussions that are going on around it? Yep, there is to no small extent. In fact, it's fascinating to do what there's two types of history you can do. You can do top-down history, which is basically where you're trying to reconstruct the events by looking at all the files, right? I go and get Army Group Center's war diary. I go and get the Army files, the Army Group files. Sorry, the Corps files, the divisional files. We make sense of events by reading documents downward. But we also get a whole different perspective on the war by reading bottom-up history. So you go out and you get, German soldiers' letters and German soldiers' diaries. It gives you a very different take on the war, but no less relevant, especially if you're doing kind of a social element. And I'm an operational historian, but I also do, no small extent, I have whole chapters in all my books looking at that kind of bottom-up perspective. And that's what's super fascinating here. There is genuine surprise among, these guys are consummate armored professionals. They're well trained in this. They know their craft. They execute their tactical operations very successfully. And when these guys come across these T-34s and even KV-1s, KV-1s are enormous tanks, far, far bigger than anything the Germans have ever built, and extremely robust. In fact, there's nothing in really the German arsenal outside of an 88mm anti-tank gun, anti-aircraft gun, which you can fire at a flat trajectory, so it can double as an anti-tank gun, although it wasn't designed for that. It's just so dumb luck it can serve in that role, and you can actually put an armor-piercing shell in it. Oh, they all fits together really nicely for the Germans, and lucky for them, because you need those 88s to stop some of these monsters that the Soviets have constructed. But there's relatively few of them. Remember I said there's 20,000 tanks? Well, I think the figure is, off the top of my head, 1,800 T-34s and KV-1s, or maybe that's just T-34s alone. So a small percentage of those tanks are these really amazing new Soviet models that are being produced. And so, we shouldn't overstate just how many of these there are. And the other thing is, if all those attendant things I was talking about before are equally important to their success, it doesn't matter how many T-34s you've got. If they've got no fuel, well, they don't mean anything. And the Soviets are very good at destroying their stuff as they fall back. So if they can't take them with them, often the Germans are encountering burnt out hulks. They're not just capturing these things and saying, great, now we've got a whole fleet of T-34s. Tactically, the Germans are still extremely apt, and a lot of these attacks and these tactical encounters that they're having, although there are instances where there's, a disaster at the front and these T-34s drive over the German lines and kill guys, tactically it's not as significant. But there is a shock at the higher levels as well, and they are instituting programs, and these are turbocharged programs to upskill their tanks. So if you're wondering where do Panthers come from that come onto the scene in 1943, and then obviously there's the Tiger 1 and things like that, well, they're arising out of this information that's being sent back to Germany about, we need much bigger scale and much better kinds of tanks. And they are studying these. There is a commission that's sent to the Eastern Front that begins a lot of this. But this is why economics is so important. It's not the sexy stuff that people want to read in operational histories, but it's important, right? It takes a long time. Once you make that recognition, it's too late. That's not going to happen on a Barbarossa timetable, right? It's not even going to happen for all of 1942. You are basically going back to the drawing boards and drawing this stuff up. So the flow-on effects are going to be long-term. The ability of the Germans to deal with that in the short term is possible only because they are tactically so well equipped and trained, and the Soviets are so badly, prepared in that way, and the fact that just dumb luck, some of the German equipment can actually deal very well, like those 88 millimeters. But that depends on a lot of things. There aren't that many 88 millimeter anti-aircraft guns, and they're very hard to set up. They take real time. You have to really preempt where are the Soviets likely to attack. They need to be then dug in usually to be most effective because they have a kind of high silhouette. That sort of stuff gets into the details a bit, but it's still important. So yeah, look, the T-34 is certainly a wake-up call for the Germans, but it's not effective for a lot of reasons that aren't to do with the specifics of the tanks themselves.
All right.
Yeah,
So,
thanks.
all right. So next question we have here is from the Meme Lord, who wants to know: do you think the USSR could have beaten Germany without U.S. support?
Yes, because I would say those critical periods of Soviet survival are very early on. Like 1941, the Soviets have to survive. How much US Lend-Lease aid gets to the Soviet Union in 1941? Almost nothing. The overwhelming bulk of the first year of the war that arrives in terms of Lend-Lease is British Lend-Lease. So British supplies, British tanks and aircraft and so on, that does arrive in Great Britain, in the Soviet Union. American Lend-Lease is coming in huge volumes in the periods thereafter, but it's actually interesting. A lot of people focus on Lend-Lease, and they're interested in the heavy equipment, right? The Soviets don't find that particularly good. Even those British tanks that turn up, they basically describe them in one report as, looking at these British tanks, they have very narrow tracks, they have light armor. These are obviously North African tanks. No, that's just what the British produced. So they don't have a very good sense that American and British material is better than their own, and that's probably quite true. The Soviets are building equipment that's better fit to the strategic environment in which they're fighting, and sometimes it's just better wherever you would deploy these things. A T-34 in North Africa would have been an amazing tank. But what's super important about American Lend-Lease is, again, the stuff that people don't focus on: aluminium, shoes, trucks, tinned food. This is stuff that the Americans produce in huge quantities, sent to the Soviet Union, and that facilitates the movement of Soviet armies. So the Soviet armies in 1943, 1944, they're driving forward. Their equipment is overwhelmingly their own in terms of at the front. But what's driving them? If you look at the photos, very often you're looking at American Jeeps, so you're looking at American trucks. Their food and their boots and all these sorts of things, and just raw materials to build aircraft. What do you need? You need aluminium. You need all these different things. And a lot of that, not all of it, but a lot of that is coming from the Americans. So what the Americans basically do is they shorten the war. We need the Red Army to have World War II end the way it does. Never underestimate how big that is. 75% of the Wehrmacht is after 1941, and even when the Allies get onto the European continent, never less than 75% of the German army is fighting in the east. And even you imagine D-Day. That's D-Day 3 years after the grinding up the Wehrmacht. So what we're encountering at D-Day is certainly not the peak of the German army. Well, they've got some very good units in the West, true, but the Eastern Front is what's grinding down the Wehrmacht and will continue to do so. So Lend-Lease is important, but when you ask the question in that way and say, would the Soviets have won the war? I would say the war is largely being won because Germany needs to end that war in the East. How anyone ever constructs for me a picture of this war whereby the Germans win against the Soviet Union and against the Americans and against the British Empire, I don't know what that pathway to victory is. I don't know. People do this, right? I read a book a couple of years ago, Why Germany Nearly Won. I didn't think much of the book, but this guy had, if only they'd gone at Stalingrad left instead of right, God knows what, with X division. I mean, it just struck me that this is so divorced from understanding the scope and scale of this war. And it is not happening at that tactical level or operational level, which if only one division had gone left or right, how in the world do they win the war? How do they compensate for their massive shortfall in manpower and resources just because they took a town somewhere? It just people do this stuff all the time. And I think it's, again, what they don't appreciate rather than what they do. Lend-Lease is super important for how the war is ended and how fast the war is ended, but it doesn't transform the war in that way.
All right. Our next question comes from Wavy. He wants to know, what was the most interesting combat unit in either the Soviet or German militaries, in your opinion?
I might just have to take a pass. The reason I would say that is because, too many people in my position, we all think of ourselves as experts, and yep, we are. But to people like you, it sounds like I can answer any question, probably. That's how my students sometimes treat me when they ask questions like that. It sounds like a perfectly reasonable question. Never underestimate how much we don't know about these armies. When you get on that scale, like, for me to answer that, I'd have to claim that, yeah, I've got a good knowledge of all the units and how big they are and how they fight. Wow, not at all. Not at all. It's a bit like the question people often ask me. They say, David, who was the best German general of the Second World War? Believe it or not, if you want to count them, it depends on what you want to count as a general, because there's multiple ranks of German general, but you're talking about a good sort of 2,000 guys. You look at all the divisional commanders over all of the war, not to mention the corps, the army commanders, and only a dozen or so field marshals. But if you put all those guys together, and then you say, David, who's the do I know the 2,000 guys? Do I know that? Has anyone even written even a tiny fraction of their bios? Nah. I count German generals all the time in my archives. I just sit there and think, who the hell is that? And so there is this huge knowledge deficit. I mean, maybe that's one of the areas that one could say, people are always saying, what hasn't been done in World War II? Well, lots. And some of those things, some of those bios would be fascinating to know, right? Who would love to do a study on corps commanders of the Eastern Front? Actually, there is some dude who did something on that in the 80s. But, that's just super interesting because I want to know who they are as well. So do I know all the units to rank them in some sort of objective way for you guys as if I'm an expert and I know them all? Super hard. Also, the other thing that makes that question really hard to answer is they're not all subject to the same pressures. There are parts of the Eastern Front that are under a lot more stress and pressure than others. So how do we really grade them? Because they're not all subject to the same conditions. In fact, I think if we were to project ourselves 100 years into the future, we're going to start to see that people like me at this point, we talk in generic terms about the Eastern Front and what is happening. I think as we get more and more specialized studies, we'll start to realize how kind of wrong in a way that is to do and just how problematic. It's not like there's a uniform experience. There's very different topographical features. There's different climates in, we're talking 2,000 kilometers of front here. And there's different units, different commanders engaging with the same problems in different ways and getting different responses. Wow, it's a whole complex tapestry of experience. And that's interesting to us, right? We want to know that stuff. So yeah, I really just can't answer. Also on the Soviet side, I'm far less well written. Can I just make one point on that? People always on the internet have a go at me in my reviews of my books. Like, I don't like David Stahl's book because he talked all about the Germans and didn't talk much about the Soviets. And I always think to myself, okay, I've done, I don't know how many books now. I got a couple of edited collections. I got 5 chronological histories, operational histories tracing this thing. I wonder when people are going to get it that I do German military history. There is so much. What did I say before? Warehouse full of files. So yeah, I'm trying to condense that into a book. I'm not trying to do a parallel. Now let's unpack the entire Soviet experience. And the one thing I love about working on the German side is, yeah, you can say whatever exists is available to me. The German state is not trying to, sweep any of their Nazi history under the rug and say, well, don't let them see these files. No, it's all there and available. If it's been found, we can get access to it. That's not the case with the Soviets. They've got the presidential archive. No, nobody gets into that. So you're still kind of writing history that's not fully informed by all the documentation. And I kind of appreciate feeling like, well, whatever is deficient in my work is either because perhaps I didn't do my homework correctly, but I'd like to think I do, or because, hey, look, we just don't have those files. They just didn't survive the war. We don't know that stuff yet. Therefore, you can do a more complete job. But not every book needs to be comparative. Just because you discuss in great detail how the mechanisms of the German army work, you don't have to in parallel discuss equally the entire Soviet system. These things, it's how you frame your book. But it's interesting to me how people seem to never get that point. They seem to they review the book they wished you'd written rather than the book you wrote, is probably the way to put it. But yeah, great question. It's just super hard, and maybe word to the wise, my friends, these guys, people out there will sell themselves on this. People will give you answers. Oh, who's the best German commander? Be skeptical that anyone really knows. These gurus who claim to know all this stuff, and then they'll give you an answer. But okay, great. So whatever, the Brandenburg, awesome. Yeah, okay, they know about the Brandenburgers. But to do that and say they're the best in the German army, 18 million men serve in the German army. How many of those other units do they really know about? How many does anyone? Be skeptical on stuff like that.
All right. So I've got a few questions here. I think these are going to be the hardest ones for you just because they're yes and no questions.
Okay.
So
that'll be tough.
First one, I know a couple of these don't go specifically in your area, but I mean, kind of just like run through them quick. So do you think the Germans could have ever beaten the Soviets?
I'm going to say no.
Okay. Could Operation Sea Lion have ever worked?
Ooh. Okay, I'm a little bit outside my depth here. I don't know Sea Lion cover to cover. There are some out there that are supposedly the better ones, but I've never read any of them. I think no. Yeah, I'll leave it at that. I think no. There's a couple of reasons for that, but let's try and get through some of these.
Okay. And do you think the Axis powers had any chance at being successful in Africa? Yes,
I think they did. I think they had better chances than the results show. And there's all kinds of reasons for that. At a smaller scale, the ability to affect things, and remember, there's really only one front here. I often think the Eastern Front is better understood to be there are multiple fronts because there are multiple armies fighting in their own areas, whereas the North African campaign, if you break through the front, well, you've broken through. There's not a lot of the width of the front. It looks like North Africa. Hey, doesn't it go for hundreds of kilometers? You can just keep going south, but you actually can't because there is these desert sands. I don't remember exactly what it's called, but this phenomenon whereby really no operations can continue. So it's a narrow front, and as we see time and again, this Benghazi stakes oscillates back and forth because they do break through the front. What's really holding up both sides is not the ability to fight or fight well. It's got a lot to do with logistics. You're fighting over very, very long distances. So yeah, look, that there are all kinds of strategic alternatives and opportunities, which if the Axis had better invested some of their supplies, and maybe even one big, tremendous alternate history, what if they'd never invaded with Barbarossa? If they hadn't sucked so much into the East, continued to benefit from the Nazi-Soviet pact, and directed Luftwaffe, naval, and motorized elements into North Africa, that would have had a huge effect because the British struggle against the limited forces that Hitler invests down there. If he'd massively invested, I can't believe that wouldn't have had a greater effect. So yeah, we'll leave it at that.
Okay. So I'm going to go back to some users' questions here. Sir Prize has a question he wants to ask in voice. Are you here?
Yeah, I'm here. It's first off, thank you for doing this. This has been absolutely fascinating. It's kind of a two-part disjointed question. The first part you kind of already answered, so this is more of an elaboration, is how much you think the Vernichtungskrieg and the Schwerpunkt or Kesselschlacht could be separated. In other words, in plain English, how much you think you can separate what the SS was doing versus what the OKH was doing. And the second question, there's a few, but I'll only ask two. The second question is if you're familiar with Dr. Jeffrey McGargie's work, and if so, what are your thoughts on it, particularly pertaining to the German General Staff and its weaknesses and strengths in the Eastern Front?
Yep. Great questions. So, in some ways you can combine those because Jeff's a fantastic historian. If you guys are looking to read books, in fact, I would say don't read mine unless you've got a real interest, because mine, there's a lot of depth in there, maybe a lot more than most people would want. If you want a really, short, simple book on Barbarossa that does exactly what I said, operational and war of annihilation in parallel, McGargie's got an awesome book on that. It's about 2006. I think it's actually called War of Annihilation. He's first rate. He's at the Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington. He has an earlier book, which was an award-winning book, inside the General Staff, the Hitler's High Command, something like that. You may know, but yeah, you can Google him, and he's got this other book. And that book was really a bit of a, it's 20 years ago, but he really is going through and deconstructing how does this high command work and make its decisions. And it's one of the earlier books to really show, hey, these guys are dysfunctional, right? Because remember, preceding 20 years ago, a lot of the literature that ever came out on the German Wehrmacht, especially in English, was, oh, they're amazing. Oh, they're so good at this stuff. Oh, look how they win wars, especially in those early periods. And that has been, really deconstructed. And McGargie's book is saying, look, this is how it's working at the high command, how certain parts are not. So there's a separation between what they're supposed to do. Imagine a German staff gathers information, really good information, that objectively informs the construction of operations, and that informs a higher strategic plan. And he's just showing that there's such a disconnect between what these guys are doing. In some ways, I foreshadowed that before when I was talking about, what is National Socialist military thinking? And that perhaps comes into the other question you're asking. You're asking about, to what extent is it possible, or perhaps even to what extent is it even necessary to understand war of annihilation with operations? That's a really fair question to ask, because you could say, but aren't they sort of different fields? At the end of the day, where I see that nexus coming, where they come together and they need to be understood, is if analysis is a really important part to understanding warfare. People think historians we're just telling the what happened, right? And we are telling you the what happened. That is, on this date, this happened. On this Panzer Division went that way and had this result. But in parts of history books that are, not just records of events, some books read very much like that. Actually, a lot of Soviet history reads like that. You want to get analysis. You want the author to stand back and then tell you, okay, I've just told you for a few pages what is happening. Here's the analysis. Here's why this matters, or how we need to understand which factors are more important here. And at that point, what you're often having to do is understand what's going on in the minds of these guys and account for why are they doing this. So, if one of the things I would say is there's a certain amount of resources that the Germans have at their fingertips. We can measure that. That's easy for me to measure because I can go in and find out, okay, how much fuel does the Second Army have? How much fuel how many munitions? This is stuff that they write down in their reports, right? Now, what I'm doing basically, if I was to subsume all of my work on Barbarossa, I'm seeing X amount of resources versus this is the operational goal or the strategic goal that they're trying to achieve. And the question for me in a nutshell is, do the resources equal the goal? And right from the beginning, I would say there's a shortfall. As Barbarossa goes on and on and on, the resources are getting less and less, but the goal remains the same. So that shortfall is getting bigger. And when I got to writing my book, book, so it's called The Battle for Moscow. I'm basically writing a book now on November of 1941. Germans are still on the offensive. I sat there and I'm looking at one of the earliest operations. It's basically one of the German armies at the southern part of Army Group Center. It's not even driving on Moscow, and it's attacking the city of Kursk, which is famous to a lot of people for a big battle in 1943. But actually, that battle in 1943 was not fought in or even around Kursk. It was hundreds of kilometers from where the fighting takes place. But there is a battle in 1941 that literally takes Kursk, right? It's not what people call the Battle of Kursk. The Second Army is the army that's driving on that. They've been driving on it for weeks, and I've been charting it in the earlier books. And they are at the end. They're not priority for Army Group Center supplies. They get all the way to Kursk, and they finally take it first days of November. So when the Battle of Moscow book that I'm writing starts, I'm having to explain to people, okay, so the Second Army has now taken the Kursk, a major city in the central part of the front, or at the bottom of the Army Group Center, but still the central part of Russia. They've taken it. And they have done it with a shoestring of logistics, and they have got actually very few divisions. That army, I think, only has about 6-7 divisions, right? So they're not well resourced at all. What happens on the night? I think it's the 3rd of November. Don't quote me on that, but I think it's the 3rd of November that they take it. So right at the beginning of this book, what do? They get orders from the OKH. Now you're going to seize Voronezh. I mean, that is a holy shit moment. What? Are you guys aware of their situation? How overextended they are? How broken these divisions are? They've given their absolute last to get to Kursk. That was their goal. That's what they've done. And now you're sending them 200 kilometers in November with all the turning weather. They're going to be caught way out on the steppe trying to get to a city that itself is going to be hard to conquer. There's just no way. Now, here's my problem. As the historian, I can't do in my book what I just did with you guys. I can't say that. I can't say, what the fuck? This doesn't make any sense at all. This is completely crazy. I can't say that to my readers because I'm the historian. I have to offer analysis. I have to explain what's going on here. But I sat there at the start of that book thinking, I can't tell you. I have no idea. This is just craziness. What the hell is going on? I can do what the guys at the time were doing because I'm looking at all their files saying, none of this adds up. Why would they even attempt this? This is not Hitler saying it. This is the Army High Command sending the orders down to a guy named Vikes. He's the commander of the Second Army. He sends those orders down to his constituent corps and the constituent divisions. And it even got, this bottom-up history. I got some soldiers' diaries that we were called to write today in Kursk, and we've just been told we're going to Voronezh, and someone said that's 200 kilometers to the east. And his basic comment is, sometimes in the army you just have to laugh because what else could you do? I mean, it's crazy. Do they not know how we are? Now, there's my problem, right? I'm a military historian. I got to make sense of this for my readers. I got to explain to them in the analysis, well, why are they trying to do this? And I'm sitting there saying, I don't get it myself. Funny thing, to be a good citizen of the university, people's seminars. And just around that time, I was asked to go to a guy who's not even a historian. He's a political scientist, and he was doing ancient peoples of Borneo, an Indonesian island. And I just went along to be a good citizen and listen to his paper. Do you know what he said? This is what he said at the beginning of his paper. Maybe you'll see the connection straight off the bat. It was a real penny drop moment for me. He said, okay, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to my seminar. Thanks very much for coming along. The one thing I'm going to tell you straight off the bat is you're going to have to park your Western education at the door because you guys are all products of the Enlightenment. If we want to understand ancient peoples of Borneo, it's a mystical world, and you have to understand it as they understood themselves, not as we try to understand, because this stuff won't make any sense, right? And I'm sitting there thinking, holy shit, that's my problem. That's my reader's problem. We are products of this Enlightenment. We deal in rationale. We make sense of things in a rational way. That's typically how the German army used to function. That's why they had a general staff. You gather information in order to make decisions. But they've separated from that. Suddenly the Jeff McGargy moment is happening. I'm like, yeah, there's a disconnect. They're not connecting the dots. They're trying to fill the gap between resources and objective with what? With Nazi thinking. Hitler, do you ever wonder, what does he get up there and talk about when he gives his big long rants? He talks about himself. He's talking about, I did this, I did that. He doesn't say, it was fortuitous back in there having a Great Depression, which facilitated a whole lot of unemployment that gave me the, no. He doesn't think of it that way. It's all him. The primacy of will is what people write about when they're talking about Hitler and how he frames this stuff. This is why, sorry, I'm making this a long answer, but I'm coming to a point. This is why studying motivations in a National Socialist space So when people are doing that war of annihilation literature, they're trying to make sense of why are these guys enacting mass murder, and why are they complicit in, and why are they watching this stuff happen, and supposedly, honorable, good people from a Christian background who are, signing off on mass murder. Why are they doing that? That's so much of that work has been done in that space. But here I am in a completely operational space. I'm not trying to make sense of the Holocaust, but I'm trying to make sense of a real problem here. What the hell are they doing trying to do operations that I can tell you on paper are not going to happen? And they seem to know they're going to happen, but they're still trying to do them. Why? Yeah, because we've taken the Wehrmacht as being some sort of normal, rational, responding to figures and numbers kind of organization, like a high command should, and that's not who they are. We should know that, because if you look at and I have been looking at the war of annihilation, that's why I was like, why didn't I see this earlier? In other words, we can't make sense of their world in a rational way because they're not necessarily themselves rational. They're buying into a national socialist worldview, which allows you to square circles. You can just always make the argument, well, Herr General, if you can't do this, I'll find someone who can, because the primacy of will is a big factor. Don't talk to me about, you haven't got enough resources, you haven't got enough manpower. Really, you haven't got enough. The Fuhrer, on his own, managed to transform Germany and conquer unemployment. That's what he always, blah, blah, blah. We have all got to be, images of him. We need people who can say, yes, I can achieve that. And so suddenly you start getting all these yes men who say, right, well, they don't look good, are they? Okay, well, we're still going to do it. Of course we're still going to do it, because if you're Vikes and you say, no, it can't be done. Your career, well, what kind of person are you? And what does Nazi propaganda celebrate? It celebrates the guys who do this. 300 men who went off and seized a bridge and held it for 4 days against overwhelming resources. That's what you read about in your own propaganda. Those guys are amazing. Yeah, like their will facilitated their success. Look at the other side to that. How many officers die in Barbarossa because they're trying to do heroic things? Huge amounts. So maybe that's a answer. Sorry, dude, but that was it's a big phenomenon. It's an important area. It's a great question you ask, and it's why we need to read more widely than just what were the schematics of tanks or what battles took place. We need to read widely in order to answer those bigger questions of war.
All right. So I've got a question for you. I think you might have heard this one before. How long does it take to get from Berlin to Warsaw?
Berlin to Warsaw. How do you mean? Do you mean in the Polish campaign?
Well, the answer is supposed to be, well, in Panzer hours.
Oh, sorry. This is a joke. I'm sorry.
So we're almost at time. We scheduled 2 hours. We've got a few people that have some more questions. Would you be okay going a little bit longer?
Yeah, go ahead, mate. Just ask.
Okay.
If someone's missed out their question, I hate to think because I take too long answering the earlier one.
So Comrade Pingu wanted to know. Well, he says most films nowadays focus on the role of Americans in defeating Nazi Germany. Do you recommend any good, accurate films about the Eastern Front?
Harder to say accurate. I mean, because that's just we all speak the English language, but we all have different definitions of be accurate. I mean, how exact does it have to be? The thing about military history is, I was talking to some guys who make documentaries. I've been in a couple of these things, and they say, you know what? If we make a documentary on, I don't know, the royal family, yeah, they get a little bit of feedback on, we got that wrong, got this wrong. Make a documentary on anything, you get a little bit of feedback. People always want to say something. You make something on military history, you get an avalanche of this stuff because people really follow these things. So accurate is probably something we need to be a little bit loose with. But there are some really good films. One thing that I would say is partly also this answer is going to be subjective. But if you look at, I haven't got the name in my head now. There's a Soviet film from the 1980s. I can picture the front cover. And what I like about this film is, in terms of accuracy, right, is, yes, they portray the War of Annihilation at a stage where the War of Annihilation wasn't as well known. That's the last 30 years, people have really done a huge amount of work on that. What's really cool about what they do in that Soviet film, it's got problems as well, is they are trying to make the watcher feel uncomfortable. And there's this awesome scene in there where for about 5 minutes, maybe even longer, maybe 8 minutes, they just have this incredibly high-pitched sound as this kid through which we're experiencing these events with watches these horrific things happening around him. They're just playing this high pitch. It's like ear-piercing. You're like, Jesus Christ, turn that off. But they don't, because they want you to be uncomfortable. And it's just these kinds of, cinematic mechanisms that the Soviets would do that no Hollywood film would ever do, that I just remember being, when I watched it, I was thinking, this is getting a bit much now. I really don't want to. At the same time, the pictures fit with the almost physical experience I'm having with this. But, if you look at more modern film, a thing called The Siege of Brest, I can't even remember what that's called in Russian. It's a Russian film, but done very, very well, right? The events are largely true. I don't know about the individual characters they show, but is there a tremendous battle fought around this town of Brest, which is sort of like a fortification, and basically these people fight for days and days and days against the Wehrmacht holding out. What else is there? Defiance, that's a Daniel Craig film. It's basically the Blitzkrieg, partisan group. It's a really good film, not just because of, I don't know, the action scenes. And actually, I haven't read the memoir that it's based on about this Blitzkrieg partisan group. But what I liked about it was, partly I go into these films often feeling like this is going to be terrible. Oh my God, it's going to be terrible. Daniel Craig, it's going to be Hollywood and all the rest. One of the earliest scenes, turns out I was wrong. He basically walks into a town. He's our good guy. These collaborators are there. Of course, they would be. They're stooges of the Germans and brutal. And he just murders them. It's just like in front of their, the two boys and the father. The boys are grown, in front of their mother. And then he just walks out, and it's kind of like, wow, okay, welcome to the partisan war. It's brutal. It's not good guys, partisans versus bad guys, Germans. There's a lot of grey in this area. There's murder, and partisans aren't always partisans. They're sometimes just thugs, surviving by killing people and all the rest of it. And it's just good to see that sort of stuff sometimes represented, not in black and white terms. So there's some really good films. There's a lot of terrible films as well. Yeah.
All right. Fox had a couple more questions he wanted to get to. You there, Fox?
Yep, I am. I'll just scroll up to them. So this question's more on Zhukov. He was in Barbarossa a bit. What I can tell, many new historians or history students tend to very uphold Zhukov for his achievements on the Western Front. Whenever someone mentions the top and skilled general in World War II, Zhukov is almost always mentioned. However, Zhukov did absolutely screw up Operation Mars and, to some extent, Operation Polar Star. What is your opinion on Zhukov? And was it more that he was lucky than a strategically good general?
That's a really good question. So one of the things that I think is changing the way in which Zhukov is viewed is, you're right, for decades after the war, he was held up as sort of this great Soviet marshal. And look, on some level, yes, there is no question that he has success and all that. What I think is transforming our understanding of him is that a lot of the orders that he issues are, extremely brutal. I mean, I don't want to sound like I'm trying to compare Soviet commanders with German commanders, because the big difference here is Germany is explicitly, with orders, fighting a war of annihilation that's leading to mass murder, but and the Soviets aren't doing this. But the Soviet commanders, and Zhukov is one of these guys. He has no problem with ordering men to do things that militarily aren't feasible. If people, in any way, aren't prepared to take part in that, he'll make examples of them. He will have commanders shot. So it's brutal. Now, some people argue, hey, come on, David, this is life or death stuff, and these kinds of decisions had to be taken. I mean, this is a crisis that the country's facing. They're faced with a war of annihilation. This isn't time for nice, benevolent commanders. This is the Eastern Front. It's not it's not the American Army or something. But the question really is, how much of that brutality was actually necessary? And I think, people who've done much more work on this, there's been one or two recent biographies of Zhukov showing kind of two things. One, deconstructing his account of these events, where obviously he's the good guy making the right decisions time and again, and showing actually he manipulates his own narrative. I mean, a lot of people do when they come to writing their memoirs, right? It's always casting themselves in a much better note, but he's also guilty of that. And then more in a perhaps more sinister way, some of these orders that he sends out there, these are brutal. These are getting large numbers of Red Army guys, and sometimes deliberately so. Like he wants to make examples of people. So I think that's what's changing our view of Zhukov. And when you start saying things like, okay, he didn't have some successful some successful operations, maybe as a bit of context for people. You briefly mentioned this thing called Operation Mars. So Operation Mars is the latter part of 42, and that is perhaps a bigger part of a battle that probably no one's heard of at a place called Rezhev. This is just, again, welcome to the Eastern Front. Rezhev is going to consume more Soviet soldiers than the battle at Stalingrad, and it's happening largely in parallel. And that's just fascinating because you'd probably say, well, Stalingrad was the big battle of 42, 43 on the Eastern Front. Rezhev is in Army Group Centers area, and the Soviets have been trying to take it back. They're trying to take it back from January. It's a 15-month-long battle from January of 42, and there's pauses in that time. But through 1942 and up to March of 1943, the Battle of Rezhev rages on. And after repeated failures through the winter of 41-42, in the summer, and now Zhukov is back with a huge amount of resources, determined to take it back. This is Operation Mars. And it's a total disaster. These aren't just, oh yeah, he didn't one successful operation, it's called Mars. These are hundreds of thousands of guys who are going to be killed in. So, if Bradley or if Patton had lost hundreds of thousands of guys, I think that would transform our view of. But the fact is, they're just fighting much smaller battles and shorter battles largely. Eastern Front battles go on for months and months. That's seldom the case in other places in the world. And in that sense, we really need to not just say, well, that was just one battle that he lost and he won a few others. It really speaks to the fact that so many battles preceding that one represented lessons that were not learned. And who weren't they learned by? Zhukov. So when we start talking about, he was so good operationally, was he really good? What did he understand? Didn't he say, right, okay, guys, we've been running into German defenses that have absolutely annihilated hundreds of thousands of guys. Shouldn't we learn something from that? Or are we too ideological to actually learn anything? And that might suggest, well, Zhukov, maybe there needs to be a lot more study done. I'm not working on the Soviet side, as I said before, but I would say one really needs to take a very critical view on particularly that battle and say, yeah, to what extent is this guy actually learning? And, it's fine if you don't succeed in January of 40, first time encountering perhaps these German defenses, the Germans on the defensive. That's not the case in December of 42. Come on, dude. What are you learning here? What staff work are you doing? What intelligence are you gathering to figure out you're trying to attack the same area you've attacked time and again, unsuccessfully, and then you're going to have massive and utterly fail. So how good is Zhukov? Yeah, that's a valid question to ask. I don't claim to have the answer. I haven't done all the work, but I think, questioning his great strategic acumen should be both the operations he launches and the necessity he seems to see for sacrificing life. You can do that in the Soviet system because it's the Soviet system and Stalin doesn't care. Oh, I lost 100,000 guys. Did you get your objective? Yes. Oh, well, fine. Okay. You wouldn't get that in the American army in World War II. What, you lost 10,000? For what? Oh, yeah, some town in North Africa. What? Yeah, the cost matters, and so it should, right? Because there should be. This is human life. Welcome to the Soviet Union. In that sense, the Soviets are sinister. And Zhukov is a part of that. That was a longer answer again, sorry.
All right. So before you go on, because I know there's nothing you wanted to ask, Fox, a couple of people have posted in chat, a couple of movies. You said you couldn't remember the name of it. Battle of Moscow or Come and See?
Come and See.
Okay. So
yeah.
I'm going to put that on my watch list. Let's see where it is. But yeah.
Might be hard to find. I remember taking, well, that's probably in the 90s. the internet wasn't as helpful as it is today. But definitely it's worth watching. Another one actually. What is the English translation of this? Unsere Mutter, unsere Vater. Generation War, I think it is. That's like a 5-part German miniseries, which is, hey, it's got problems. Well, accurate, I think was the way it was framed earlier. I don't know if I'd want to say these guys are all accurate, but there's 2 of the protagonists who are on the Eastern Front, and some of the scenes are, I think really, really good. But I'll just leave it there.
All right. So, Fox, I think you had another question. Then we'll move on to someone else.
Yeah, I did. I just wanted to reason I asked that Zhukov question. My opinion of him changed a couple of years ago when I read David Glant's book, Zhukov's Greatest Defeat.
Yeah, that's the one. Yep.
Yeah, no, that's when my opinion of him changed suddenly.
Even in the Russian history, they talk about that. But Glantz is just a phenomenon. That guy is, the amount of literature he's done, the amount he's covered. He is the sort of the great don of the Eastern Front. He focuses more on the Soviets, but some fantastic work.
Yeah, I also read When Titans Clash as well.
People often ask me, what's the big summative history? What would be the one you'd recommend? And there's that one. He did that with Jonathan House. When Titans Clashed.
I think so. Yeah, I believe so.
Yeah,
it was. It was.
Yep. And then there's another one called Thunder in the East by Evan, and that's also a really good. I really enjoy. He's got good analysis. I really quite enjoy his analysis. He doesn't always agree with me, and I don't always agree with him on everything. But hey, welcome to the world, right? People don't always have to agree. But it's a first-rate history, and so is When Titans Clash. They're the 2 I tend to, treat my sort of go-to summative histories of all of this.
Yeah. So my last question is a bit more of a lighter question. Have you been able to write your upcoming book a bit quicker because of the lockdown?
My coming book. Which one do you mean? Am I able to work right now?
Well, have you been writing a bit faster thanks to the lockdown? Because
not really. Not really. Our semester runs obviously a little bit different from the Northern Hemisphere because we've just come out of summer. So we start our academic year in March, and I'm teaching 3 courses. Well, I'm teaching one that's my own. I'm teaching into another one, and I've got a small honours course. So we've all just changed to being, online, like pretty much every other university, I think, that has the capacity to do that. And that just requires obviously a lot of changes. I'm also history program coordinator, so there's all this admin, and I'd love to say I'm getting research done, but the reality is it's just trying to keep everything running in a very different forum, and that creates its own issues. But I'm hopeful that I'm going to get a sabbatical a second half of the year, and I was supposed to get it, but I was supposed to go to Germany, and now they've cancelled that because there's no Germany to go to. So I'm hoping I still get that, but as what we would call internal release, and then I really would get some stuff written, but we'll see.
All right. Next question we've got is from Eyebrows. He wants to know, did other countries in the Axis powers contribute manpower to the Eastern Front? And if they did, what happened to the men after the fall of Berlin? Were they sent back to their countries or kept as POWs?
Okay. Did other countries fight here? This is going to sound like I set this question up for one of the books, but I have a book that came out in 2017 called Joining Hitler's Crusade, European Armies and Operation Barbarossa. So basically, his things, again, people just don't know about the Eastern Front. That book charts 17 different countries, 17 that are going to contribute troops to the Eastern Front for Germany. And some of them are whole armies that are being deployed. There are 6 countries that do that. The Finns invade. The Romanians send 320,000 guys in 2 armies. The Hungarians send a corps, which is like 60,000. The Italians send a corps, 60,000. The Slovakians send 40,000. There's a Croatian formation there. And so, that's 6 countries that are sending, huge numbers. Put all these guys together, it's like 750,000. So there's 3 million plus Germans, and you can get up to 4 million if you start counting Axis guys. This is just extraordinary. Again, it speaks to the scale of all of this stuff. And then there's all these other countries that are not national armies, but are volunteers. So if you imagine, okay, France is, we think of it as an allied country. It is an allied country. It's also occupied. Are there fascists in France? Oh, yeah, there are fascists in France, right? Same in Belgium, same in Holland, same in Denmark, same in Norway. And these fascist organizations then start saying, oh, well, right, it's the Great War against Bolshevism, and their followers are, ready to do their part. So they sign up, and these guys end up on the Eastern Front. So there are, crazy as it might sound, there are Norwegians on the Eastern Front fighting in a Norwegian, it's not a Norwegian unit, they wear a Wehrmacht uniform, but they have a little Norwegian, marker on their shoulder. So when you start thinking about what is Barbarossa, what is this war in the East, in some ways you can style this as something of I'd even say global war. Why would I say global? Because, there's a whole lot of countries that are contributing to this, not in huge numbers. Don't overstate it. I mean, it's like 1,000 guys out of Norway. But nevertheless, part of Norwegian history in the Second World War is not just, we were an occupied allied country with our resistance formation. Yeah, and there was also a fascist regime, and they were also sending forces to the Eastern Front. And on the Soviet side, remember, the Soviet Union doesn't exist anymore. It consists of 15 constituent republics, 5 of which are Central Asian republics, right? And their history of the Second World War is this war. So there's a lot of countries that feed into this. I mean, dozens. Also, the Eastern European countries that host this war. Poland doesn't send troops to either side, but they host the war. So Polish history is the Eastern Front. And you cannot divorce all of this scale of warfare from the wider war that's taking place. You can't say, the Eastern Front was just some other area like it didn't matter. It's absolutely essential because of those numbers. So it's a fascinating history. And basically what my book was trying to do was answer this question, a perennial question for this area. So why do the Romanians get involved in this war? Now, I can't really answer that question because I don't have Romanian. So if you're thinking, well, what sort of research can you do on that question? That book cannot be written by any, I don't care how good they are. There's no historian who can write that book, because even if you did have Romanian, you don't have Slovakian, you don't have Hungarian, you don't have Finnish, you don't have Norwegian. So the only way to do that is what we call an edited collection. So I'm the editor of that book, but because I know my own limitations, it's about going out there and finding, I got the best guy in Norway who would know about Norwegian deployments in the Wehrmacht and their participation on the Eastern Front. And luckily, a lot of these best people signed up into this project. And they're basically answering a single question. Why did this country get involved? Now, sometimes that's a national story. Why did they send their army? So, you go top down. But sometimes it's all about these volunteers, right? Why did all these, Dutch volunteers join the Wehrmacht? And there's not one answer because there's a whole bunch of individuals making that decision. So that becomes more social history. And the book's just a really fascinating, and I don't say that because I put it out. I say it because that team of writers who took part in that book, that was just great. I have to say, of all the edited collections I've worked on, that was the one I think I just found really easy to work on because my contributors did such a great job, and they're just easy people to deal with. Never underestimate, edited collections can be a nightmare. People say they're going to write things and never do, and it's stress. But these guys were just great, and the book just came together so well. It's not had that many reviews or anything. Edited collections don't really attract that much. That they don't sell anything anywhere near as well as normal books. But it's just an important book because there is no other book like that. If you ever want to know about why did these guys get involved, and there's also part of the chapters are also tell me a bit about, I said also I want to know a little bit about the campaign, not just why they made the decision, but how did that turn out? Sorry, dude. The last part of your question was the POWs. That's a bit of a difficult one to answer, partly because, again, I don't claim to have knowledge of how were the Norwegians treated versus the Dutch versus the Spaniards versus whoever else. So that level of knowledge I just don't have. But look, generally they're treated as fascists. I mean, these guys are also in some ways different. German soldiers, well, they're in the Wehrmacht, right? There's conscription. They must go, right? Some of these other guys, though, they know they don't have to go. If you're a Norwegian on the Eastern Front, it's not because someone, conscripted you. No, you're a volunteer. You wanted to go. That can sometimes affect how they're seen, how they're treated. It takes a very long time before a lot of these guys ever turn up back in their countries. And let's be honest, a lot of them don't survive Soviet captivity because it's hard. It's hard labor. They're not fed well. There's diseases in the camps, and frankly, even a lot of POWs and anecdotal. We don't have a lot of information around this. They're just murdered outright. I mean, especially if you're known to be, if you're a guy captured by the Soviets, they can see you're an SS guy, and they know this is a war of annihilation. That probably doesn't do well for your chances of immediate survival. Yeah.
All right. And Rap had another question you wanted to ask. I think we'll wrap it up here. If you guys have any last minute questions you want to put in, throw them in the questions channel. But I don't want to take too much longer here. Go ahead, Rap.
Yeah, this is sort of just a joke. You were talking about, being able to open up more in Discord. And I was just wondering, with Discord AMAs becoming more popular, what is the MLA versus Chicago method for citing these in our papers?
One of the things, perhaps the way to answer this, I don't really know. I've never even heard of someone citing an interview. And when my students say, "Oh, David, can we cite your lecture?" The answer is no, we can't. And the reason why is, and this is, you're going to push back on this, and perhaps fair enough, but the reason why you couldn't cite a lecture normally in history is because back in the day, lectures were never recorded. In fact, even at my university, they've only been for, I think, 4 years now. So normally a lecture, there is no recording of it. So anything you cite in paper is just your interpretation of what I said. It's not objectively provable. The idea with literature is, if you say, "Oh, I don't know, John Erickson, Jeff McGargy wrote this," people go back to that book, look at exactly page 137, exactly what he wrote. And if you've misunderstood it, we can check that, because no, you've missed the point here. That's not what happened. But with a lecture, it's not objectively provable because they're normally not recorded. Now you're going to say, but these things are. This is apparently being recorded. So yeah, you could technically cite it. So I guess that's a bit of a new space for us. But I still give my students the advice, when they did say to me, "I found this, YouTube video, David, of someone saying something," I'm always a little bit skeptical, because we're also telling people to vet their sources. And again, we're coming out of a tradition of vetting literature, and it's easier to vet literature because it seems to a lot of people like books are books, aren't they? Books aren't books, right? University press, there's standards. Never underestimate military history. There are publishers out there totally unscrupulous. If you just tell me it's Nazis, got Hitler in it, people will buy it, so we'll publish it. We don't care about peer review. We don't care about a lot of that stuff. And so, books aren't books. You need to be able to have some sort of criteria by vetting these things. So what exactly is the criteria now that we're in this new technical space? Look, I'd say the short answer to that is less, was this recorded on Discord? If you can say, I don't want to answer for your professor, get you in trouble, but it would seem to me if you could put something in there saying, "Oh, Jeff McGargy gave a lecture. Jeff McGargy lectures on YouTube. Jeff McGargy on YouTube, and this part comes 38th minute to the 42nd minute." Something short time frame, so that you're not just saying, "Oh, the lecture," and expect the person who's going to vet this to watch an hour lecture, which they'll never do. But something very specific, then maybe passes the test, because people can access the information, very specific information, and it's verifiable. That's the key thing with history, that the stuff you're saying, the whole point of a footnote is it's verifiable. Remember, this is a discipline, is an objective method. It's not just rants on the internet, which aren't provable, right? It's just someone saying stuff. Who cares? But academic papers are objectively provable. You can find it in primary material or in secondary material. So that's probably a long answer again, but I can't answer for your own papers. I guess in the new world, we've got to kind of be understanding of this. So maybe that's the way you do it. I don't know. You say the David Stahel means something. You can know that guy's someone who's actually got some credibility. It's not Uncle Bob's History Channel. But yeah, so maybe that's the way to answer it.
Thanks. And real quick, I did find an English version to come and see that I posted in the YouTube chat. And I took a class in Soviet film in grad school, and we did a whole host of Soviet movies. And another one that I liked is Ivan's Childhood, if you haven't seen that one.
Oh, I've got it on DVD. Yes, awesome. Yeah, that's a great film. I love the ending.
Yeah, right. And I guess in our class was because a lot of the Soviet children have lived in war. Ivan, at the end of the movie, spoilers, he had to die because throughout his young childhood, all he knew was conflict.
Yeah, you know, I must admit, personal taste, but I find too many movies about war, and especially the Eastern Front, a way to take glory in war, because it always feels like, oh, what are we selling people? What do they think here? Maybe that's because they just want a story, they don't care about reality. But for me, I kind of like a sad ending in a movie, especially about war. It feels just somehow more real to me, and I'm always worried that these other films that all end on this whatever note of, national aggrandizement. They're just selling shit, and it annoys me. But yeah, so a sad film, and there's plenty of them. I don't know. It just feels like, wow, that's an emotional roller coaster. That says something. Yeah, personal point.
All right, and surprise, if you're still here, man, we got another question from you. Let's see. Oh, my Discord's acting up. You should be able to speak now. Go ahead. Prize?
Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, this is more of the unanswerable hypotheticals, but one, and I'm not sure if you answered these before I got in, but one, what do you think would have happened had the Finns had a more expansive war aim and helped out more with Leningrad instead of just trying to recapture what they lost in the Winter War? And the main one is, what do you think would have happened had Barbarossa been launched on time in May? Given how close they got, do you think they would have got Moscow? Obviously, I don't think that would have been decisive. I think you agree, but do you think that would have altered the course of history at all?
The older literature often posed that. They said, the Barbarossa date is pushed back. And if only they hadn't pushed it back. In some ways, though, they are struggling, and not all the formations at the launch of Barbarossa are fully established in the way they're supposed to be. So, again, if we would have sent this thing back 5 weeks, you would have had less establishment, so that the forces wouldn't have been, in whatever ways that they're not prepared. That would be even less developed. The other big thing, though, and this is a point that too often was not understood in a lot of those earlier books that made those kinds of determinations, talked about this earlier date, is what always happens. The seasonal cycle in Russia is something called the Rasputitsa. So it's the time without roads, and that's a biannual. So it happens in October when the rains come. There's all this, this huge swaths of the country. It's not so much today because there's a much better irrigation and the roads are better and all the rest of it. But back then, whole areas would be just bog, and that happens again in spring, when all of the long months of snow has deluged the land, and then all of that slowly melts. The rivers become, much stronger, and the ground is still marshy as all of that, moisture is being absorbed by the earth. Now, there is a late thaw in 1941. And so the Germans are very much aware of this, and they're discussing to what extent are those, field Vic, the dirt roads, to what extent, and just the countryside, to what extent is that still really, really moist? That late thaw is really the reason why they're pushing that back. So these people who don't really understand that, and this is earlier authors saying, they just should have launched the operation. Apart from the fact that the Ostheer wouldn't have been the Ostheer of 22nd of June if they'd done it in May, but also, more importantly, to operate these kinds of armies in this rapid form movement that they need to have, that is absolutely dependent on the kind of ground that they'll be operating on. So one can't just ignore those factors. And so I don't think it would have been, for all the reasons I've been talking about, but also for those really important, any kind of huge game changer. In fact, we may have seen that would have really helped the Soviet defense, because it would have bogged down those earlier attacks. To what extent, I don't know. We'll never know. But that was very much what the Germans were discussing, and it's very much why they delay, which is a good reason. What was the first question? I just should have written it down.
The first question was if you think it would have made any difference if the Finns had more expansive war aims and actually pushed towards Leningrad and whatnot.
Well, the Finns really do. In fact, that's one of the critiques of the Finnish War. So, if anyone's wondering, there's a winter war that happened in 39-40. That's perhaps the famous one that the Finns fight against the Soviets. But then they have what they call in Finnish the continuation war. They don't like the idea that they were German allies. They like the idea that no, really German allies, even if we kind of were. We never joined the Axis, but hey, we lost a whole lot of land, and that's fair. And they sought a perfect opportunity because everyone at that point thought, well, Germany is going to win this thing, right? And we want to be at the peace table as well, and we'd like to get back our land. But the question for the Finns is, were they just seeking to retake the land they'd lost in the Winter War, or are they setting much more expansive goals to take back land that, depending on which part of history you want to call, Finnish empire or Finnish lands or Finnish people, but they're clearly seizing a lot more than they had in 1939. They are deliberately driving into Soviet territory, and they are also driving on Leningrad. They don't continue that, but they're only holding that because their own. I mean, they're a very small country, and they've mobilized a tremendous amount of their manpower. 600,000 men for the size of the country is phenomenal. They're far more mobilized than Germany is, but that cost to the economy means they're also banking on this being a very short, sharp war, and they can suddenly get all the men out of the military again and go back to bringing in the harvest and running the economy. They're not equipped for a long war, and that's what they find themselves in. But they do set, is the word imperial goals. They're looking to expand their territory, and they can't manage it. There's also Germans in the north of Finland who are trying to aid them, and they're still not successful at cutting off Minsk, which is such an important supply line. That's where a lot of that early Lend-Lease is coming through. Later it will come through Iran and through Vladivostok even. But early on it's coming through Minsk, and they're wanting, one of their big goals is to cut that off, and they can't manage to do it. Actually, one little tiny tidbit of history that might be just fascinating to some people: the British actually send a fighter squadron to the northern part of Finland and engage the Wehrmacht on the Eastern Front. They're nominally there to train. Oh God, sorry, I got that completely wrong. They send it to the northern part of Russia. They're in and around Murmansk, and they're training Soviet pilots to nominally to fly British Lend-Lease fighters, but they actually end up in battles with German pilots in Finland. So there's actually a British fighter squadron fighting on the Eastern Front for a short time in 1941, which is kind of fascinating.
No, that's all great. That the Finnish part is a revelation to me. I thought they were more limited in their aims than that. Thank you.
No worries. There's a really good book, but phenomenally expensive, an edited collection with a whole bunch of good essays. I should really have all these books all downstairs. Finland, it's called. There's tons of literature out there, but that was a really good recent book. But it cost something like $250 or some crazy amount of money.
All right. So before we do wrap up here, Tripod, who got this together, said that he basically wanted me to argue with you. Basically, I'm just going to put out my view of how Barbarossa was a near victory for the Germans. You've put some dents so far into what I think, but I still actually think it was possible for them to win. I'll just lay it out, and then you can have your fun with it. So
I'll keep my answer short, whatever I do.
I'm sure you have a lot to say. Have your wicked way with it. So, I think that there's a few different things that went wrong with them. Of course, they weren't quite ready for it. They should have launched it a bit earlier, and the rains were bad, and they didn't. They're like they had a lot of logistical issues. However, I think that's something that they could have handled if they did push through Moscow. The idea being that if you can actually get to Moscow, and once you really push through the city, pushing through the the eastern side, the eastern outskirts would not be much more difficult. But basically the idea is if you get the metropolitan area of Moscow, that is itself a giant chunk of not just the production capacity of the Soviet Union, but also the manpower they have. And one of the main reasons why I think they had a big issue here is because of the weather, and it was almost bad luck, but it was one of the, the rain season came on early, and it was one of the worst winters in Russian history. It was particularly cold. The whole German war machine was based on Blitzkrieg, tanks rushing through fast with air support, and when it came in, I think it was late October, they started having problems, where they couldn't run the planes. They, the propellers would freeze, and they'd basically try and take hammers, smash off the ice, and do what they can. But of course, their whole, ability to fight was based on that, Blitzkrieg tactic, which was, had the legs taken out from it. Like, like as you were saying, they lost a lot of, tanks, but also, there was a lot that, couldn't run. They were getting, like you were talking about, they got stuck in the mud. Mechanical, I guess you could call that mechanical failure, but and the planes.
No, yeah.
So I think that, honestly, had the weather been a bit different and they had, a little bit more time to push forward, I think they could have done it. Because one of the main things is, we talk about how many men they had. As you point out, there were troops coming from the Eastern Front, but the Germans, of course, it was their vanguard was not much. It was, I think, a couple divisions were within 30 miles of Moscow. But as I recall, I was reading on this, Moscow only had, at this point, because they had lost so many troops in the West, they only had about 500,000 troops to defend that area. So I think it was Army Center had 500,000 at a certain point, around October, November. They only had about 500,000 men there. And those were almost entirely fresh conscripts. And if I remember right, 4 out of 5 did not have weapons. So even the 500,000 men they had there, I think, it basically would be, as I understand, roughly 100,000 men in their center, to fight on, because 4 out of 5 didn't have weapons at that point, and those who were there, they were inexperienced. They weren't veterans of the last few months, or experience from the war in France, etc., as the Germans were. And so I think, honestly, if the weather patterns were a little bit different, just to I'm not so sure if a normal winter weather pattern would have been enough, but if basically the weather, if it was a little bit of a late instead of an early muddy season, I think the Germans could have pushed on. And it's not so much like that, they had the divisions there on the front lines, as you were saying. It's mostly just the vanguard. Most were catching up, but I think the vanguard actually could have pushed through, just because there was so little left to defend Moscow, and that would have denied the manpower and resources that the Russians needed to really win the war. I'm not saying it would have caused them to surrender, but if I think it's about 80% of their people or more lived west of the Urals. Like if more than half of their country or half of their people are living under Nazi occupation, I don't think there's much they can actually do to carry on for an effective fight. But that's my point.
No. Look, the one thing I like about these kinds of debates is, everyone in my area is a bit of a, they're an expert and they always think they know what they're talking about. But once you move into the realm of, change any part of history, yeah, look, I still think there's a degree to which we can debate in these places, but nobody really knows. Obviously, I have a bit of a different take, and I just put a few things out there, and I want to try and do this more succinctly than some of my other earlier answers. One would be worst winter and early, onset of that winter. These are things, and look, this is not on you. This is on historians, because for decades, I would even say until really the 90s, the standard of literature on the Eastern Front is just poor. It's really quite amazing how these books, because what did I say before? They've got to be objectively provable. Go back to see, what did these guys use as their source material? Yeah, these books are written time and again out of German generals' memoirs and so on. That's just not a good enough source. Those guys were already manipulating history because their role in it was so criminal on the one hand and complicit in failure on another. So what do they say? The winter was terrible. It came much earlier. It was a horrendous winter. Yeah, how many winters have they experienced in the Soviet Union. And what is there, if you go back Russian history through the 19th century, which is the time when we have probably the only records, we don't really have records from the 17th century of each Russian winter or each Russian season. Yeah, it's absolutely normal that you will get these deluges of rain. The Rasputitsa comes in October. It comes in October in 1941. It's not particularly bad. We have the temperatures every single day. And we have the temperatures from German diaries. The temperatures aren't, wow, oh my God, it got down to 0 degrees or in late October. That's not amazing. It's only minus at night. It gets to positive territory. It'd actually be better for the Germans if it had stayed minus, because then the roads would finally freeze. But it doesn't. It gets warm again during the day, and then all the mud and whatever, a little bit of snow is now melting again. So this narrative that the Germans had this terrible, terrible winter, and if only it hadn't, as one of the OKH reports, sorry, it's a guy who was in the OKH, the High German Army, he writes, the fact that it's cold in winter in October and November and has rain and snow belongs to the ABC of a winter campaign. Doesn't anyone know that? And I'm kind of like, yeah, I love citing that because that just sort of sums it up. The next thing is you talk about, we're having this battle in Moscow, this hypothetical battle. It never even took place. The closest the Germans got was 30 kilometers away. And as you said, correct, Army Group Center controls about 800 kilometers of front. So when people cite that and they say, the Germans got to within 30 kilometers of Red Square, well, a very, very small part of a very large army group got to within that. They didn't even get there. They got to within that, right? Moscow has been fortified in a way few other places in the Soviet Union have since July of 1941. This is a fortified city. It is a concrete big city. Ask the question, and one guy has done fantastic work. His name's Adrian Wettstein. He's a Swiss military historian. He has written the book on German urban warfare doctrine. And what did they do? They fought some battles in 1941. Cities, and he wrote, his book ends in Stalingrad, so he's really done the work on how did they fight there. They're on a learning curve. They might be good tactically, in the field. That's the kind of battles that they've been fighting, that they've been trained to fight, but they don't have a good doctrine. In fact, they don't even really have a doctrine. There's a few fragments of information in various books that Adrian was able to find that talk about how do they fight urban warfare, and they are not well prepared for it. At a place called Dnepropetrovsk, they fight a big battle in 1941, and he just shows, these guys don't know really how to do this stuff. They're throwing their guys into a watching machine. Urban warfare is extremely costly. So what would it have been in Moscow, a much bigger city, far bigger than Stalingrad, with a fragment of the forces they could send there? They don't have an entire army Moscow with. It's a bigger city than Moscow, than Stalingrad, with more civilians in it and more Red Army guys. And the Red Army has got more reserves behind Moscow than Stalingrad had at the early stages of Stalingrad. Remember, what's going to happen on the 6th of December? There's going to be multiple reserve armies going into a major Soviet offensive. I'm not sure about your figure there about how many that come. How many guys don't have rifles? It's something you read, but again, that sounds to me like, that sounds like the older literature again. They all don't have rifles. Yes, I'm not making a case, and you'd be 100% in saying that the Soviet forces are not what a lot of people say. They always say, the Siberians with this fantastic winter clothing and everything in the winter, and that's also problematic. Most of them aren't Siberian. Most of them haven't got wonderful. Most of them aren't wonderfully equipped. That's just also a myth. But the options that the Wehrmacht would have had to take a major city like that in the winter, certainly straight off the march at the end of a tenuous supply line, is hugely questionable, I would say. And the final point I would just make on this is, what would Moscow have meant? In context of a war of annihilation, what choice do the Soviets have, whether they have Moscow or don't have Moscow? Yes, Moscow was a communication network, very important, large population center. It also was, an industrial center. There's no question that would have been a problem. But the Germans aren't being held back by just the Red Army. They're being held back by their own supply lines. They are massively overextended in the east. And it's not just in the length of the front, it's also the depth. They have got 3 security divisions per army group. That's 9 divisions to hold, I couldn't even tell you how many hundreds of thousands of square kilometers of land, the entire Soviet Union. And that's just the Western territories. The further they keep going east, the more of this they get. Virgin forests, partisan territory. And the Germans are just extending that in width and in depth. The ability for them to control these spaces is inadequate, massively inadequate. And because the Nazi system with National Socialist military thinking reacts to a problem not with rationale but with violence, that's what they try to do. We'll just go into dead zones of partisan activity and kill everybody. That's what they start doing in 42 and in 43. And how does that work out for them? Do they ever solve their partisan? Just chart that whole trajectory? The partisan problem just gets worse and worse and worse. And they're not just fighting partisans all over the East. They're fighting them in Yugoslavia. How many enemies do the Germans have? And it's a country of 80 million people. It's totally mobilized. They can't get more troops. They try to. And they're always trying to compensate for their lack of success by Nazi methods of just increased violence. And it never solves their problem. Yeah. What does that tell you? I'm not telling you. I'm just saying that more to the Nazis, right? They never learn their own because they're stupid. Because, yeah, when you abrogate the early modern Enlightenment and don't approach problems rationally, when you've thrown morality out the window, you've thrown science out the window. God, they even throw Clausewitz out the window. That's a German guy who kind of writes the book, if there is a book, on what do we know and what do we learn about military operations. These guys, in some cases, Kleist, that Panzer Group commander in Army Group South, he'd never read it. He even says that after the war. I remember reading that and thinking, oh, that's just told me a whole lot. He said, oh, Clausewitz, yeah, I never read him. I know he's really important, but I never read him. I thought, wow, I wonder how representative that statement is. I would have thought every one of these guys would have read him. And then when you look at what some of these guys are signing off, you think, yeah, maybe that makes a lot of sense because there's some fundamental things they missed. So what would Moscow have meant? Would that have meant, okay, well, now that's only to understand the war in operational terms. Moscow is somehow important. But there's a whole other dimension to Soviet resistance. If you're faced with an existential existence question, suddenly it doesn't really matter. You have to continue fighting against the Germans. And this is a country of 200 million people. Were they going to be able to kill 200 million people? Even with their Holocaust, with industrialized killing of people who are defenseless, they killed 6 million. Taking on the Soviet Union, I don't know what pathway to success, and I don't even know what success looks like for the Germans in that space. They would have been fighting that war for decades, and they wouldn't have won it. And more success they have in taking ground, the more people that are opposing them. Rebellions. The Nazi model doesn't work, and luckily it doesn't. But the Soviets pay a huge cost. Anyway, that will be my answer.
All right. Well, thank you so much for coming on, David. Really appreciate it. Love to do this again sometime if it works for you. Again, thank you so much for coming on. It's been fantastic.
You're most welcome. Thanks very much, everybody.
Thank you.
All right,
thanks
guys.
a lot.
So if you would like to, just open up, I'm sure some people are going to want to yell at me for my views here. If you guys aren't currently, if you guys are currently muted, you can just leave the chat and rejoin, and you should be able to speak.
So I mean, it's a rarity to have intelligent VCs